Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into the misty landscapes of Ireland, where death omens wail only for the chosen few. We're talking about the Banshee. Before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? And if you're from Ireland, have you heard of the Banshee? Do you have any stories about it? Maybe something a grandmother told you, or something you can't explain. I'd love to hear your stories. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Hollywood wants you to believe the Banshee screams for everyone. That she's some kind of equal opportunity death omen floating around Ireland, wailing whenever someone's about to die. A democratic spirit of doom, if you will. She's not. The Banshee has standards. Specifically, she has a list. And for most of Irish history, that list contained exactly 5 family names. 5 bloodlines deemed important enough, ancient enough, or cursed enough, depending on who you ask, to warrant their own personal harbinger of death. Everyone else could die quietly. The Banshee wasn't interested. This exclusivity wasn't accidental. It was the entire point. Having a Banshee attached to your family wasn't a curse in the way you'd expect. It was proof. Proof that your ancestors mattered. Proof that your bloodline stretched back to the Milesians, the last great wave of Celtic conquerors who swept into Ireland around 1000 BCE and sent the Tuatha Dé Danann, Ireland's divine race, underground. Literally. The fairy folk didn't disappear. They just moved into the hills, the side, the fairy mounds dotting the Irish countryside like ancient grave markers. And from those mounds, certain spirits kept watch over the families who had displaced them. The Banshee was one of those watchers. Her name, Bean City, translates to Woman of the Fairy Mound, which is considerably more elegant than Screaming Death Lady, a name most Hollywood writers would have chosen. Not ghost, not demon, fairy. She belonged to the other world, that liminal space between the living and the dead, between mortal Ireland and the realm of the Aos. And she served specific families because those families had a connection, ancestral, territorial, or spiritual, to the land itself. So when people ask why the Banshee only cried for 5 families, the real question is this. What made those 5 families different from everyone else in Ireland? The answer lies in blood, land, and a very long memory. Let's start with the list. The 5 families who could claim a Banshee as their own family heirloom, supernatural babysitter, or, depending on the century, their worst nightmare. The O'Neills, kings of Ulster, rulers of the north, and arguably the most powerful Gaelic dynasty in Irish history. Their Banshee had a name, Maeve, sometimes written as Maven. And she didn't just wail outside their homes. She had her own room in Shane's castle, the O'Neill family seat, a dedicated bedroom. For a ghost. The family kept it empty out of respect, or possibly out of fear that she'd burn the place down if they didn't. Which, incidentally, she eventually did. In 1816, the Earl O'Neill decided to host a party and needed every available room, including hers. Maeve was not amused. Guests at the gathering reported seeing a pale figure hovering above the flames as the castle burned. The O'Neills learned an important lesson that night. You can disrespect a lot of things in Ireland. Weather, politics, neighbors, English rule, but you do not disrespect your Banshee's personal space. The O'Briens, kings of Thomond, rulers of Munster, descended from the legendary Brian Boru, the High King who died defeating the Vikings at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. Their Banshee was named Eibel, sometimes spelled Abil, and she wasn't just any fairy woman. She was the queen of 25 other Banshees. A full entourage. When an O'Brien was about to die, Eibel didn't wail alone. She brought backup. Multiple Banshees keening in harmony was Ireland's way of saying, someone important is leaving. Abel's territory was Lowrisk in County Clare, near Bunratty Castle, where the O'Briens held court for centuries. To this day, locals claim you can still hear her wailing near the old ruins when the wind shifts just right, or when an O'Brien, no matter how distant the bloodline, approaches death anywhere in the world. The O'Grady's, another Munster family, closely tied to the O'Briens, but fiercely independent. Their Banshee didn't have a recorded name, but she had a reputation. She appeared most often as a young woman with golden hair, dressed in shimmering white, beautiful, haunting, and absolutely relentless. The O'Grady's, like the other great families, understood that hearing her wail wasn't a question of if someone will die, but who. The O'Connors, High Kings of Connaught, rulers of the western provinces, and one of the oldest continuously documented Gaelic families. Their Banshee was described in various accounts as both a maiden and a crone, shifting forms depending on how she felt about the family member about to die. If she appeared young and sang softly, it meant the deceased had lived honorably. If she appeared ancient and shrieked, the message was clear: you should have done better. The Kavanaghs, sometimes written as Caun Hanach in the Old Gaelic, kings of Leinster, rulers of the southeastern provinces, and the family that proved the Banshee's attachment wasn't purely geographic. Kavanagh descendants scattered across Ireland, emigrated to England, sailed to America, and even settled in Australia. And wherever they went, the Banshee followed. Not metaphorically, literally. Accounts exist of Kavanagh family members in Boston, Sydney, and Buenos Aires hearing the wail hours before receiving telegrams confirming a relative's death back in Ireland, or sometimes right there in the new country. These 5 families, the O'Neills, O'Briens, O'Grady's, O'Connors, and Kavanaghs, were the core, the original. The ones whose Banshees were documented, named, and woven into Irish history as firmly as any king or battle. But here's where it gets complicated. The list expanded. Not officially. There was no Banshee registry office handing out certificates. But over the centuries, other families, particularly those with the O or Mac prefix, began reporting their own encounters. The O'Donnells, the O'Sullivans, the McCarthys, the O'Reillys, the Maguires. The pattern was clear. If your surname started with O-Y, meaning descendant of, or Mac, meaning son of, and your family had deep Gaelic roots, you might have a Banshee. Why? Because those prefixes marked you as Milesian. As a descendant of the ancient Gaelic families who had ruled Ireland long before the Normans arrived, long before the English planted their flags, long before Christianity reshaped the island's spiritual landscape, the Banshee didn't serve newcomers. She served the old blood, the families who remembered when the Tuatha Dé Danann walked openly, when fairy mounds were sacred, when the boundary between the mortal world and the other world was thin enough to step through on certain nights. And this is why the exclusivity mattered. The Banshee's wail was never just a death warning. It was a reminder that your family had history, weight, and a connection to the land that stretched back millennia. It was a supernatural pedigree, proof that you weren't just Irish. You were Old Irish, the kind of Irish that predated written records, that survived Viking raids and Norman invasions, that held on to language, tradition, and memory when the rest of Europe was trying to erase it. To hear the Banshee was to be acknowledged by the otherworld itself. Which brings us to the most important question. Why did the Banshee care? Why would a fairy woman, a being from the otherworld, attach herself to mortal families and spend centuries, possibly millennia, mourning their dead? There are 3 main theories, and none of them are comforting. Theory 1. The Banshee was a wronged woman, a mortal who suffered at the hands of one of these great families. Maybe she was murdered. Maybe she died in childbirth after being abandoned. Maybe she was betrayed, cast out, or dishonored in a way so profound that her spirit couldn't rest. And so she was cursed, or cursed herself, to forever mourn the family that destroyed her. Not out of love, out of grief turned eternal. This theory aligns with accounts that describe the Banshee as weeping, genuinely weeping, as though each death reopens an old wound. She's not celebrating. She's reliving her own tragedy over and over, bound to the bloodline that caused it. Theory 2. The Banshee was an ancestor. A woman from the family's distant past. Someone who loved her descendants so deeply that even death couldn't sever the bond. She watches over them from the other world, and when one is about to die, she mourns because she knows. She's already on the other side. She sees what's coming, and her wail is both a warning and a lament, the cry of a mother, grandmother, or ancient matriarch who cannot save her children or refuses to let them die unnoticed. This theory explains why some banshees, like the O'Neill's Maeve, were treated with respect, even reverence. They weren't enemies. They were family. Theory 3. The Banshee was never mortal at all. She was always a fairy, a member of the Sea who formed an attachment, voluntary or otherwise, to certain bloodlines when the Milesians conquered Ireland. Some accounts describe her as a servant, assigned by the Tuatha Dé Danann to watch over the families who had displaced them. Others describe her as a guardian, a spirit who chose to protect the old Gaelic lines because those families, for better or worse, preserved the memory of the otherworld when Christianity tried to bury it. This theory makes the Banshee neither vengeful nor compassionate. She's simply bound. Duty, magic, or ancient contract keeps her tied to these families, wailing not because she wants to, but because she must. All three theories might be true. The Banshee isn't one entity. She's a role, a type of spirit, and different Banshees might have different origins. Maeve, the O'Neill Banshee, might be an ancestor. Ibel, the O'Brien Banshee, might be a fairy queen. Another family's Banshee might be a woman wronged centuries ago, her grief still fresh. What they all share is this: they cry for the old families. And they cry because those families, whether cursed or blessed, earned the attention of the otherworld. Now, let's talk about what it actually meant to hear the Banshee. First, you had to be the right kind of person. Not everyone in the family could hear her. The dying person almost never heard her. That would be too kind, too simple. No, the Banshee's wail was reserved for close family members. A son might hear her wailing for his father. A wife might hear her keening for her husband. A sibling might wake in the night, heart pounding, hearing a sound that no one else in the house could detect. This selectivity made the Banshee terrifying in a very specific way. You couldn't confirm it. You couldn't ask your neighbors, "Did you hear that?" Because they hadn't. You were alone with the knowledge, alone with the sound, and you knew, with absolute certainty, that someone you loved was about to die. The wail itself varied by region. In Leinster, they said it was so shrill it could shatter glass. A piercing, bone-rattling scream that tore through the night like a blade. In Ulster, it sounded more like two boards being struck together, rhythmic, deliberate, almost mechanical. In Kerry, witnesses described it as low, mournful singing, a melody so sad it made grown men weep without understanding why. But every description shared one detail: the sound carried. It traveled across hills, through forests, over rivers. You could hear the Banshee from miles away, her cry drifting on the wind, drawing closer, circling your home like a predator. And when it stopped, when the silence returned, you knew. Death was no longer approaching. It had arrived. The Banshee didn't just wail once and vanish. In many accounts, she cried for 3 nights in a row before the death occurred. 3 nights of sleepless terror. 3 nights of waiting. 3 nights knowing that someone in your family was marked, but not knowing who. Imagine that. Imagine lying in bed, hearing that sound, and mentally cataloging everyone you love. Your father, aging but still strong. Your brother, away on business. Your child, feverish but improving. Who was it for? Who had the Banshee come to claim? And then, on the 3rd night, the wail would stop, and within hours, you'd receive the news. Your father collapsed in the fields. Your brother's ship went down in a storm. Your child's fever spiked, and by morning, they were gone. The Banshee didn't lie. She didn't make mistakes. If she wailed for you, death followed. But here's the part that makes the Banshee more than just a ghost story. People believed her. Not in a superstitious, maybe it's true way. They believed her the way you believe in gravity. Functionally, practically. If the Banshee wailed, you prepared. You called family home. You settled debts. You made peace. You said goodbye. In rural Ireland, well into the 20th century, families would cancel trips, delay business, and hold vigil when the Banshee was heard. Priests were summoned. Last rites were prepared. The community gathered, not because someone was sick, but because the Banshee had spoken. And she was never wrong. This reliability made her both feared and strangely respected. She wasn't a trickster. She wasn't cruel. She was a messenger. And in a world where death often came suddenly, disease, accident, violence, the Banshee's warning gave families something precious. Time. Time to gather. Time to grieve. Time to prepare. That's why the 5 families, and later the broader Gaelic families, didn't try to banish her. They couldn't. But even if they could, some wouldn't have. Because as terrifying as the Banshee was, she was also a gift. A final gift from the otherworld to the bloodlines it still remembered. Of course, not everyone heard her. Some deaths came silently. No wail, no warning. Just sudden loss. And when that happened, people whispered. They wondered, had the family lost favor? Had the bloodline thinned too much? Had they married outside the old families, diluting the connection until the Banshee no longer recognized them? Or had she simply been busy elsewhere? Because here's the thing about the Banshee. She followed bloodlines, not borders. When the O'Neills scattered during the flight of the Earls in 1607, fleeing Ireland after their rebellion against English rule failed, their Banshee didn't stay behind. She followed them to Spain, to France, to Italy. Accounts exist of descendants hearing her wail in Madrid, in Paris, in Rome. When the Kavanaghs emigrated during the Great Famine in the 1840s, sailing to America and Australia in coffin ships, their Banshee crossed the ocean with them. Irish emigrants in Boston reported hearing her. Settlers in Sydney woke to her cry. Even families who anglicized their names, changing O'Neill to Neil or Kavanagh to Kavanagh, couldn't escape her. The Banshee didn't care about spelling. She cared about blood. This persistence across geography became one of the most documented aspects of Banshee lore. In 1893, the Irish Times published a letter from Patrick Farrell of Kildare. He described hearing sobbing in his yard one night, then seeing a white deer. He tried to strike it with his walking stick, but the blow hit nothing. Empty air, and the creature let out a scream he hoped never to hear again. That same night, his cousin died. In Australia, half a world away, the Banshee had wailed in Ireland for a death occurring on another continent. Another account comes from Italy in the late 1800s. A man named Nilsini, formerly O'Neill, had changed his family name generations earlier after fleeing Ireland during the French Revolution. He considered himself Italian. His children spoke Italian. He hadn't set foot in Ireland in decades. But one night, he heard the wail. His friends, dining with him, heard it too. They asked what it meant. Nelsini, suddenly pale, said, "It means the death of someone very closely associated with me." He was struck dead by a heart attack 2 hours later. The Banshee had found him, despite the name change, despite the distance, despite a century of separation from Ireland. The blood remembered, and so did she. This is why the question, why does the Banshee only cry for 5 families, is more complicated than it seems. Because by the 19th and 20th centuries, the Banshee wasn't crying for 5 families anymore. She was crying for 5 families and their sprawling global descendants. Thousands of people, tens of thousands, spread across every continent where Irish immigrants had settled. And yet the exclusivity remained. If your name was Smith or Brown or any of the Norman or English surnames that came later, the Banshee ignored you. She served the old blood, always. This created a strange social dynamic. In Ireland, particularly in rural areas, having a Banshee was a mark of status. It meant your family mattered. It meant you were old Irish, not a blow-in, not a planter, not a newcomer. You were rooted, connected, recognized by the other world. Families without Banshees sometimes envied those who had them, which is absurd when you think about it. Envying someone for having a supernatural death omen attached to their bloodline. But that's how powerful identity was in Ireland. The Banshee wasn't just a ghost. She was proof. Proof that you belonged. Proof that your ancestors had walked this land when it was still wild, when the Tuatha Dé Danann ruled, when fairy mounds glowed under moonlight and the boundary between worlds was a breath away. And for the Irish, especially those living under English occupation, under foreign rule, under centuries of cultural erasure, that proof mattered. The Banshee was memory made audible. She was history refusing to be forgotten. She was the old Ireland, crying out in the darkness, reminding her people that they were never alone, even in death. But to understand why the Banshee chose these families, we need to go back further, much further, back to the moment when Ireland's fate was decided by invasion, conquest, and a very complicated family tree. Around 1000 BCE, give or take a few centuries, because ancient dating is more art than science, a group called the Milesians arrived in Ireland. They came from Iberia, modern-day Spain, sailing north in search of new land. What they found was an island already occupied by the Tuatha Dé Danann, a race of divine beings who controlled the elements, practiced magic, and had zero interest in sharing. The Milesians didn't care. They fought. They won. And in the aftermath, they struck a deal that would shape Irish mythology forever. The Tuatha Dé Danann would retreat underground, literally, into the fairy mounds, the side that dotted the landscape. They would rule the other world. The Milesians would rule the surface. 2 kingdoms, 1 island, separated by a veil, so thin you could sometimes step through it by accident. This wasn't a clean separation. The Tuatha Dé Danann didn't vanish. They became the Awa Sea, the fairy folk, and they remained deeply involved in mortal affairs. They blessed. They cursed. They appeared at crossroads, near rivers, beside ancient trees. They took lovers, made bargains, and occasionally stole children just to keep things interesting. And they watched the families who had conquered them. The 5 great families, O'Neill, O'Brien, O'Grady, O'Connor, Kavanagh, weren't just any Milesian descendants. They were the royal lines. The families who became high kings, provincial kings, clan chieftains. They held power, land, and most importantly, memory. They remembered the old gods. They honored the fairy mounds. They left offerings at sacred wells. They understood that Ireland wasn't just dirt and grass. It was layered with otherworldly presence. And the otherworld noticed. The Banshee, as a member of the AOSC, didn't serve these families because she was ordered to. She served them because the connection was already there. Blood, land, and respect. The Milesians had taken the surface, but they hadn't tried to erase what came before. They adapted. They absorbed the older traditions. They married into families who claimed descent from the Tuatha Dé Danann. This created something unusual, a ruling class that existed in both worlds simultaneously. Mortal kings with fairy ancestry. Christian lords who still left milk out for the good neighbors. Warriors who prayed to saints, but also respected the hawthorn trees where the AOSC dwelled. The Banshee's attachment was the proof of that dual existence. She wailed for families who hadn't forgotten, who still believed, even after Christianity arrived, that the veil was real, and that respect for the other world wasn't superstition. It was survival. Now, here's where the exclusivity gets even stranger. The Banshee didn't serve Normans. She didn't serve Anglo-Saxons. She didn't serve the English who arrived later, planted their estates, and renamed half the island. This wasn't xenophobia. It was something older. The Banshee recognized bloodlines that predated Christianity, predated written history, predated the Roman Empire's collapse. If your family arrived after the Milesians, you simply weren't on her radar. There were exceptions. The Geraldines, an Anglo-Norman family who settled in Ireland in the 12th century, reportedly had a Banshee. This shocked everyone, because the Geraldines were Norman, not Gaelic. But here's the thing. They went native. They married into Irish families, adopted Gaelic customs, spoke Irish fluently, and became, as the saying went, more Irish than the Irish themselves. The Banshee, it seemed, respected cultural conversion. Another exception was the Bunworth family in County Cork, Anglo-Saxons by origin. Their Banshee appeared during the death of Reverend Charles Bunworth, a Protestant minister who had spent his life supporting Irish musicians and preserving traditional songs. The Banshee, apparently, appreciated his work. Music, after all, was sacred to the AOSC. These exceptions proved the rule. The Banshee didn't care about blood purity for its own sake. She cared about connection, about families who honored the old ways, consciously or not, about people who understood that Ireland's landscape wasn't just geography. It was memory made solid, and memory had a long reach. Let's talk about the Keening women, because the Banshee's origins are inseparable from them. In traditional Irish culture, death wasn't a private affair. It was communal, ritualized, and loud. When someone died, the body was laid out in the family home for a wake. Friends, neighbors, and relatives gathered. They drank, told stories, and most importantly, they hired keeners. Keeners were professional mourners, almost always women, who wailed over the dead. This wasn't casual crying. It was an art form, a performance. The best keeners could improvise laments, ceoned, which translates to keening, or more accurately, the sound of grief deciding volume control is optional, that praised the deceased, consoled the family, and guided the soul toward the afterlife. Their voices rose and fell in rhythmic patterns, half song, half scream, designed to pierce the heart. These women were respected, feared even. Their grief was so raw, so powerful, that witnessing it could break a person. The best keeners were in high demand. Wealthy families paid well. The keening at a nobleman's wake could last for days. But the Catholic Church hated it. To church officials, keening looked too pagan, which is church code for, we can't control it, therefore it's evil. Too old, too connected to Ireland's pre-Christian past. It reminded them of the other world, of spirits, of traditions that refused to die even after centuries of Christian rule. So the church condemned the practice. They called it excessive, unholy, inappropriate. Keeners were accused of being too loud, too theatrical, too willing to accept payment for grief. Some priests claimed that paid mourners couldn't truly mourn, that their sorrow was fake, that they were sinners exploiting death for profit. And then the stories began. Whispers spread that some keeners, after they died, were cursed to continue mourning forever, transformed into banshees, condemned to wail not at wakes, but before deaths, to cry for families they didn't know, for people who hadn't died yet, trapped in an eternal loop of grief. This origin story, part folklore, part church propaganda, became deeply embedded in Irish culture. It explained why the banshee sounded so human, why her cry resembled keening, why she appeared as an old woman with long, unkempt hair, because that's exactly how keeners looked, aged, dressed in black, hair loose and wild, faces wet with tears. But it also did something more subtle. It connected the banshee to a tradition the church couldn't fully erase. Keening survived, quietly, in rural areas, well into the 1900s. And whenever someone heard the Banshee, they heard an echo of those women, the ones who refused to let death pass unnoticed, who gave grief a voice. The Banshee, in this light, wasn't a punishment. She was a preservation. The old ways, refusing to be silenced. Regional variations made the Banshee even more complex. In County Clare, she was called the Badb, a name borrowed from the war goddess of Irish mythology. This Banshee appeared as a beautiful young woman with golden hair, dressed in shimmering white. She sang rather than wailed, her voice so lovely it drew people toward her before they realized what she was. In parts of Munster, she was known as the Bean Shawint, the Keening woman, and her cry could shatter glass. Witnesses claimed windows cracked when she passed, that her voice vibrated at a frequency human ears could barely process. In Ulster, she sounded mechanical, two boards striking together, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone hammering a message into the night. In Kerry, she sang softly, mournfully, a lullaby for the dying. These weren't different banshees. They were the same entity, filtered through local memory, local language, and local fear. Every region shaped her according to what death sounded like to them, but all accounts agreed on certain details. She combed her hair, always, with a silver comb, and finding that comb was dangerous. Irish folklore is filled with warnings about picking up combs lying on the ground, especially near rivers, forests, or fairy mounds. If you picked one up and it belonged to the Banshee, she would follow you. She would come to your door, demanding its return. And if you refused, if you kept it, thinking it was valuable or merely pretty, she would make your life unbearable. The solution, if you were foolish enough to take the comb, was to return it immediately. But not by hand. You used iron tongs. You held the comb with iron, threw it through a window, and hoped she accepted the apology. Iron, ancient protection against fairies, was the only buffer. The Banshee couldn't cross iron, couldn't touch it, couldn't harm you if you stood behind it. But why the obsession with combing? Some scholars argue it's symbolic. Combing represented preparation. In traditional Irish funerals, the body was washed, dressed, and hair combed before being laid out. The Banshee, by combing her hair, was preparing, announcing, performing the ritual before the mortal family even knew they needed to. Others say it connects to older Celtic beliefs. Hair held power. It was a source of magic, of identity. Cutting hair was transformative. Growing it long was a mark of status. The Banshee, by endlessly combing her hair, was maintaining a connection between herself and the mortal world. Each stroke of the comb was a thread, binding her to the families she served. Or maybe, more simply, combing was the only thing she could do. Her hands were occupied. Her grief was channeled. And the repetitive motion, stroke after stroke, matched the rhythm of her wailing. Whatever the reason, the comb became her signature. You couldn't depict a Banshee without it. Now let's talk about the diaspora, because this is where the Banshee proved she wasn't bound by geography, logic, or the Atlantic Ocean. The Irish emigrated in waves. The flight of the Earls in 1607, the Cromwellian deportations in the 1650s, the Great Famine in the 1840s, economic desperation in the 1880s. By the 20th century, more Irish lived outside Ireland than inside it. They scattered to America, Canada, Australia, Argentina, and England. And the Banshee followed. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. She physically appeared, or was heard, in places where no Irish spirit should logically exist. She wasn't tied to geography. She was tied to blood. GPS tracking, but make it supernatural. A woman in Boston, descended from the O'Briens, woke one night in 1923 to hear keening outside her tenement window. She lived on the 3rd floor. There was no one there, but the sound was unmistakable. 3 nights later, she received a telegram. Her uncle had died in Cork, An O'Neill descendant in Sydney, Australia, reported hearing two boards striking together outside his home in 1887. He hadn't thought about Ireland in years. His family had anglicized their name to Neil, but the sound haunted him. He wrote to relatives in Ireland asking if anyone had died. The letter arrived too late. His cousin had already been buried. In Argentina, where thousands of Irish settled in the 1800s, families with Gaelic surnames reported seeing a woman in white near rivers. She appeared, wailed, and vanished. Deaths followed within days. The Banshee, it seemed, didn't need Ireland's landscape. She needed the bloodline, and blood traveled. This persistence baffled scholars. How could a localized Irish spirit, tied to specific mounds and territories, manifest across oceans? The usual explanation, that emigrants brought the folklore with them and projected it onto coincidental sounds, doesn't hold up, because too many accounts involved witnesses who didn't know the folklore, who had never heard of the Banshee, who were second or third generation, assimilated, fully integrated into their new countries. And yet, they heard her. One theory suggests the Banshee exists outside time and space, that she's not bound by physical laws the way mortals are. She's a fairy, after all, a being of the other world. And the other world, in Celtic belief, wasn't a place. It was a state, a layer of reality that existed everywhere simultaneously, hidden just behind the veil. If the Banshee could access that layer, she could move anywhere. Ireland, America, Australia. Distance was irrelevant. She simply stepped through the veil wherever the bloodline existed. Another theory is simpler but more unsettling. The Banshee duplicated. Each branch of the family that split off, that emigrated, that settled somewhere new, took a piece of her with them. Not the original Banshee, but an echo, a splinter. The O'Neill Banshee in Ireland was still Maeve, but the O'Neill Banshee in Boston was Maeve's reflection, operating independently, mourning the same bloodline across an ocean. This would explain why multiple family members, in different countries, reported hearing her on the same night. She wasn't traveling. She was everywhere the family existed, which raises a terrifying question. How many Banshees are there? If every branch of every old Irish family has their own Banshee, or shares one that duplicates, the number would be staggering. Thousands. Tens of thousands. An invisible network of mourning spirits crying across the globe whenever an O'Brien, O'Neill, O'Connor, Kavanagh, or any other Gaelic descendant approaches death. The world in this light is full of unheard wailing. Most people just aren't listening, but the families are. Even today, in the 21st century, descendants of the 5 great families report encounters. Not often, but regularly enough that folklore societies document them. A woman in Chicago hears keening and learns her grandmother in Galway has died. A man in London sees a figure in white combing her hair by the Thames and receives news that his father suffered a heart attack in Dublin. The Banshee adapts. She appears beside modern roads, near apartment buildings, in cities that didn't exist when she first began wailing. She's been reported near hospitals, which makes a grim kind of sense. Where else would death gather so consistently? Some families have tried to escape her. They've changed their names, converted religions, married outside Irish bloodlines, moved to countries with no Celtic history. None of it worked. The Banshee doesn't care about paperwork. She doesn't recognize legal name changes, government-issued documents, or the very expensive lawyers people hired to make those changes official. She recognizes blood. And blood, no matter how diluted, how distant, how forgotten, still carries memory. You can run from a lot of things. Geography, history, even identity. But you can't run from your ancestors. And the Banshee is the proof. So when people ask, why does the Banshee only cry for 5 families? The answer is layered. She cries for 5 families because those 5 families were the beginning, the original, the ones who ruled Ireland when the other world still walked openly. She expanded her service to include their descendants, their branches, their distant cousins, because bloodlines spread, because families grow, because the O'Neills of 1000 CE became the O'Neills Neils and Nielsen's of 2000 CE, scattered across every continent, speaking every language, but still carrying that original connection. The Banshee is exclusive, because exclusivity was the point. She doesn't wail for everyone, because not everyone is connected to the land, the history, the other world in the same way. She serves the families who remember, consciously or not, that Ireland was never just Ireland. It was a battleground between mortal and fairy, a place where two kingdoms coexisted, separated only by belief. And she wails because someone has to, because death, in the old Irish tradition, was never meant to be silent. It was meant to be announced, mourned, witnessed. The Keeners understood this. The families understood this. And the Banshee, whether she's a wronged woman, an ancient ancestor, or a fairy bound by duty, continues the tradition. She gives the families one last gift: acknowledgement, recognition, the knowledge that when you die, you don't vanish into nothing. You're remembered, you're mourned, you're seen, even if the only one who sees you is a woman from the other world, combing her silver hair, crying into the Irish night. The historical record, for all its gaps and biases, contains enough documented Banshee encounters to make even skeptics pause. These aren't vague folktales passed down through generations until the details blur. These are specific accounts with names, dates, and witnesses who wrote them down, often reluctantly, because admitting you heard a death fairy wail didn't exactly boost your credibility in polite society. Take Shane's Castle, the O'Neill family seat in County Antrim. In 1812, the castle was preparing for a grand celebration. The Earl O'Neill, eager to accommodate all his guests, made a decision that future O'Neills would probably call monumentally stupid. He repurposed every available room, including the one traditionally kept empty for Maeve, the family Banshee. The party went ahead. Music, dancing, wine, the full aristocratic experience. And then, in the middle of the festivities, fire broke out. Not a small, containable fire. A roaring inferno that consumed the castle with terrifying speed. Guests fled into the night. Servants grabbed what they could. And multiple witnesses, standing outside watching the flames, reported seeing a pale figure hovering above the blaze. A woman. Translucent. Unmistakable. Maeve, apparently, had opinions about her accommodations. The castle was destroyed. The O'Neills rebuilt, eventually, but they never forgot the lesson. You don't disrespect your Banshee's personal space. Modern visitors to the ruins, now a tourist attraction, still report strange sounds at night. Low wailing, the rustle of fabric where no one stands, the feeling of being watched by someone who isn't quite present. The O'Briens have their own documented encounters, particularly around Bunratty Castle in County Clare. In the 1600s, during a period of violent political upheaval, the O'Brien chieftain was warned by multiple family members that they'd heard Ibel wailing. Not just one voice, many voices. A chorus of banshees, harmonizing in grief. The chieftain dismissed it. Political concerns outweighed superstition. He had enemies to deal with, alliances to manage, wars to fight. He didn't have time for fairy nonsense. He died 3 weeks later, assassinated. And at his funeral, locals reported hearing the wailing again, louder this time, as though Ibel and her 25 attendant banshees were mourning not just his death, but the family's failure to listen. Then there's the strange case of the Dalek River, nicknamed Banshee's Brook, near Bunratty. When the river runs low during droughts, the water turns red. Scientists explain this as iron deposits rising from the riverbed. Geology, chemistry, nothing supernatural. But local folklore tells a different story. When the river runs red, the Banshee's cries can be heard, and the water doesn't return to its normal color until someone in the area dies. Superstition? Coincidence? Mass hallucination driven by environmental stress? Maybe. But County Clare residents, even today, watch that river carefully. And when it turns red, they call family members. They check on elderly relatives. They drive more cautiously. Because whether or not the Banshee is real, the pattern holds. The river turns red. Someone dies. The river clears, repeat. You could call it confirmation bias. Or you could call it paying attention. During World War I, Irish soldiers serving in the British Army reported hearing the Banshee in France. Not in Ireland, in the trenches. Specifically in the forests near the front lines, hours before major offensives. Men with Gaelic surnames, O'Donnells, O'Sullivans, McCarthys, would wake their comrades, insisting they'd heard keening in the distance. Their fellow soldiers, mostly English, Scottish, or Welsh, heard nothing. But the Irish soldiers knew, and some refused to advance. They deserted their posts, fled into the woods, risking court-martial, because the Banshee's wail was a certainty. Death was coming. The officers could shoot them for cowardice, or the Germans could kill them in battle. At least desertion offered a chance. Some were caught and executed. Others were killed by enemy fire anyway. A few survived and later wrote about the experience, trying to explain to disbelieving readers why a Celtic death omen had manifested in a European war zone, thousands of miles from Ireland. The explanation, if you accept the Banshee is real, is simple. The bloodline was there. The old families had sent their sons to war, and the Banshee, bound to those families, followed. She didn't care about trenches or borders or the politics of empire. She cared about the O'Neills fighting in the mud, the O'Briens dying for a king they didn't believe in, the Kavanaghs bleeding out in no man's land. She wailed for them, just as she always had. In the 1950s, an anthropologist conducting fieldwork in rural Galway interviewed dozens of residents about their Banshee experiences. The resulting documentation, published in an obscure academic journal that almost no one read, contained first-hand accounts from people who had heard her within their lifetimes. One woman described waking at 3 a.m. to the sound of someone crying outside her cottage. She lived alone. Her nearest neighbor was a mile away. She opened the door. No one. But the crying continued, circling the house, growing louder, more desperate. She returned to bed, pulled the blankets over her head, and prayed. The next morning, a messenger arrived. Her brother, living in Dublin, had died of a heart attack. At 3 a.m., a man in his 70s recalled hearing two boards knocking together when he was a boy. His father heard it too. They didn't speak about it. They didn't need to. 3 days later, the boy's grandmother, who had been healthy, vibrant, working in the garden that very morning, collapsed. Dead before she hit the ground. Aneurysm. Undiagnosable in that era. Unpredictable. Except the Banshee had known. A farmer described seeing a woman in white combing her hair beside a stream on his property. He approached, thinking she was lost, needing help. She looked up. Her eyes were red. Not bloodshot, red. Completely red. No whites, no irises, just red. He ran. That night, his cousin, who lived on the next farm, died in his sleep. Pneumonia. He'd been ill, yes, but recovering. Everyone thought he'd pull through. The Banshee disagreed. These accounts share common threads. The wailing comes at night. It's heard by family members, never strangers. It precedes death by hours or days, never weeks. And it's always, always correct. No false alarms, no mistakes. The Banshee doesn't cry wolf. If she cries, someone dies. This reliability is what made her so terrifying and so trusted. Modern encounters haven't stopped. Online forums, genealogy websites, and Irish cultural societies regularly receive reports from people claiming Banshee experiences. Some are obviously fabricated. Attention seekers, creative writers, People who heard a fox and decided it was something more interesting, but others are harder to dismiss. A woman in New York, 2019, posted that she'd woken to keening outside her apartment. She had Irish ancestry, O'Connor on her mother's side, but hadn't thought about it in years. She was third-generation American, fully assimilated, barely Irish except on St. Patrick's Day. The sound terrified her. She called the police. They found nothing. 2 days later, her mother, visiting relatives in Ireland, died in a car accident. A man in Melbourne, 2015, described hearing rhythmic knocking at 2 a.m. His surname was Neil. His great-great-grandfather had emigrated from Ulster in the 1880s, changing the spelling from O'Neill. The knocking persisted for 3 nights. On the 4th day, his brother, living in Perth, died of complications from diabetes. A teenager in Dublin, 2021, filmed herself hearing what she thought was a woman crying in the garden. She posted the video online as a joke, captioning it, "Local ghost won't shut up." The audio captured faint wailing. Comments flooded in from Irish users saying, "That's a banshee. Take it down. Don't mock her." The girl laughed it off. Her grandfather died that week. She deleted the video. Skeptics point out that with millions of people claiming Irish ancestry worldwide, coincidental deaths following strange sounds are statistically inevitable. And they're right. Confirmation bias, grief, and the human tendency to find patterns in randomness explain many, possibly most, Banshee reports. But not all of them. Not the ones where the sound is heard by multiple witnesses simultaneously. Not the ones where the death occurs in a way no one could have predicted. Sudden accidents, instant heart attacks, undiagnosed illnesses. Not the ones where the person hearing the wail had no knowledge of Banshee folklore and only learned about it afterward. Those cases sit uncomfortably in the data. Too specific, too consistent, too old. Because the Banshee legend isn't new. It's not a modern internet phenomenon. It's not a folktale invented to scare children. It's documented in Irish manuscripts from the 1300s. It appears in Norman literature from the same period. It was recorded by English travelers in the 1600s, often with disdain, but recorded nonetheless. By the 1800s, it was so embedded in Irish culture that immigrants leaving for America would ask relatives, "If the Banshee cries for me, will you send word?" That's not superstition. That's belief. Functional belief. The kind that shapes behavior, decisions, and entire communities. And the 5 families, the O'Neills, O'Briens, O'Gradys, O'Connors, and Kavanaghs, never stopped believing. They passed the stories down. They warned their children. They respected the mounds, the old places, the liminal spaces where the veil thinned. They understood that having a banshee wasn't a curse. It was a legacy. Proof that their family had walked this land when it was still wild, when the other world was as real as rain. So why does the Banshee only cry for 5 families? Because those 5 families earned her attention. Through blood, conquest, and an unbroken connection to the land that predates Christianity, predates Rome, predates written history. They ruled Ireland when the Tuatha Dé Danann still walked openly. They made alliances, marriages, and treaties with the other world. They remembered. And the Banshee, whether she's a wronged woman, an ancestral spirit, or a fairy bound by ancient duty, remembers them. She cries because she must, because the old bargains still hold, because the veil, though thinner now, stretched across continents, diluted by time, still exists. And as long as the bloodlines survive, as long as someone somewhere carries the name O'Neill, O'Brien, O'Grady, O'Connor, or Kavanagh, she will continue to wail. Not for everyone, never for everyone. Only for those who belong to the oldest memory Ireland still holds. The memory of a time when the boundary between mortal and fairy was a breath, a step, a choice. The Banshee is that memory, crying into the night. A voice from the other world, reminding the 5 families and their countless descendants that they were never alone, that someone is watching, that someone remembers, that when they die, it will not go unnoticed, even if no mortal hears. She will. Who the Banshee served and why those 5 families earned her attention is one thing, but knowing who she cries for doesn't explain how she operates. And the Banshee's mechanics, the rules governing her appearances, her limitations, her strange rituals, are where the folklore gets truly specific. Too specific to be purely invented. Because here's the thing about the Banshee. She's not a ghost who does whatever she wants. She has rules, strict ones. And those rules, passed down through centuries of encounters, reveal something fascinating. The Banshee isn't random. She's bound. By duty, by magic, by something older than Christianity, older than the written word. She operates within a framework, and that framework tells us more about what she is than any origin story ever could. Let's start with the most counterintuitive rule. The person about to die cannot hear her. Think about that for a moment. You're dying. Within hours or days, your heart will stop, your lungs will fail, your story will end. And the one supernatural entity specifically assigned to announce your death, to mourn you, to acknowledge your passing, makes herself completely inaudible to you. You hear nothing. You suspect nothing. You go about your day, unaware that somewhere, possibly miles away, your family members are hearing a sound that makes their blood freeze. A wail that tells them you're marked, that your time is finished, that they need to prepare. But you're oblivious. This isn't an oversight. It's deliberate, and it's consistent across every account, every region, every century. The dying person never hears the Banshee. Only those close to them do. Parents, siblings, children, spouses, close friends occasionally, but never the person whose death she's announcing. Why? The most common explanation, offered by Irish folklorists who spent decades collecting these stories, is mercy. The Banshee's wail is a gift to the living, not the dying. It gives families time to gather, time to reconcile, time to say what needs to be said before it's too late. If the dying person heard the wail, they'd spend their final hours in terror, knowing, waiting, unable to escape. By making herself silent to them, the Banshee allows the condemned to live their last moments in peace. Ignorant peace, perhaps, but peace nonetheless. There's a darker interpretation, though, one that aligns more closely with older Irish beliefs about death and the soul. In traditional Celtic cosmology, the soul began separating from the body before death occurred. Not instantly, gradually. And during that separation, the dying person existed in a liminal state, half in the mortal world, half in the other world. The Banshee, being a creature of the other world herself, might only be audible to those still fully anchored in the mortal realm. The dying person, already crossing the veil, simply can't perceive her. Their ears are tuned to a different frequency now. They're hearing things the living can't. Voices, music, loved ones who died years ago, calling their names. The Banshee's wail, by this logic, isn't silent to them by choice. It's silent because they've already started leaving. Either way, the rule holds. And it creates a strange dynamic. Families hearing the Banshee know someone is dying, but they don't always know who. If multiple relatives are elderly, or ill, or traveling through dangerous conditions, the wail becomes a guessing game. A horrible, anxious guessing game, where you mentally catalog everyone you love and wonder which one the Banshee came for. Imagine that uncertainty. Imagine lying awake, having heard the keening, and thinking, is it my father, my sister, my child? Is it the uncle overseas, or the cousin who's been coughing for weeks? The Banshee tells you death is coming. She doesn't tell you whose. That ambiguity, far more than the wail itself, was what terrified people. Some families developed their own methods for narrowing it down. They'd send messengers to check on distant relatives. They'd visit neighbors. They'd pay attention to who the banshee was heard near, because although the wail carried for miles, it was always loudest near the person about to die. If the keening came from the east, families looked east. If it circled a specific house, they knew. And once they'd identified the target, preparations began immediately. Which brings us to the second strange rule. The banshee can only keen while combing her hair. This limitation appears in accounts from nearly every Irish county. The banshee is always described mid-action, running a comb through long flowing hair. Silver hair, white hair, red hair, depending on the region, but always combing, always in motion. The comb itself is silver, sometimes gold, and occasionally described as glowing faintly in the moonlight. She can't wail without combing, and she can't stop combing while wailing. Why? What possible reason would a death spirit have for tying her mourning to a grooming ritual? One theory connects it to ancient Irish funerary practices. When someone died, the body was prepared for the wake. Washed, dressed, and most importantly, hair combed smooth. Presentation mattered. Death didn't excuse sloppiness. The dead were sent off looking their best, hair neat, face clean, hands folded. The banshee, by combing her hair while she wails, is performing a symbolic preparation. She's readying the deceased, even if they haven't died yet. The act is anticipatory, ritualistic. She's grooming them for the other world. Another theory, rooted in Celtic magic, suggests hair held power. It was a source of identity, of strength, of connection between the physical and spiritual. Cutting someone's hair could weaken them. Growing it long was a mark of vitality. Warriors grew their hair as a symbol of prowess. Druids never cut theirs. The banshee, by endlessly combing her hair, is maintaining a thread between herself and the mortal world. Each stroke is a gesture of binding. She's anchoring herself here, in this moment, to this family. Without the combing, the connection breaks. She fades back into the other world. The wail stops. Or, more cynically, the combing is a limitation imposed on her, a rule she must follow, whether she wants to or not. Like a curse with fine print, you will mourn the families. You will announce their deaths, but only while performing this specific, repetitive, exhausting action. Forever. That would explain why some descriptions of the banshee emphasize her weariness. Her red eyes aren't just from crying. They're from centuries, possibly millennia, of combing and wailing, unable to stop, unable to rest. The comb itself became deeply significant in Irish folklore. Finding a silver comb on the ground, especially near water, forests, or fairy mounds, was considered extremely dangerous. If it belonged to the Banshee, picking it up would summon her. She'd follow you home. She'd demand its return. And if you refused, consequences followed. Not death, necessarily, but misfortune, illness, bad luck that clung to you like smoke. Animals died. Crops failed. Relationships soured. Everything you touched seemed to wither slightly. The solution, if you were foolish or desperate enough to take the comb, was immediate return. But not by hand. You used iron tongs to hold it. Iron, the ancient ward against fairies, created a buffer. You threw the comb through a window, preferably at night, and prayed the banshee accepted the apology. Some stories describe people who kept the combs. Collectors, thieves, people who didn't believe in fairy curses and thought a silver comb was worth the risk. Their fates varied. Some died mysteriously. Some went mad. A few, oddly enough, lived long, prosperous lives, suggesting the banshee either forgave them or simply forgot. But most accounts agree. Taking the banshee's comb was like stealing from a force of nature. Technically possible, wildly inadvisable. Now let's talk about her appearance, because the banshee doesn't present the same face to everyone. In some accounts, she's young and beautiful. A maiden with flowing white or silver hair, dressed in a shimmering gown, pale as moonlight. Her voice, when she wails, is almost musical. Mournful, yes, but hauntingly lovely. She looks like something out of a pre-Raphaelite painting, ethereal and tragic. In other accounts, she's ancient and terrifying. A crone with matted gray hair, hollow eyes, and skin stretched tight over bone. Her teeth are rotted or missing. Her nails are long and sharp. Her voice is a shriek that rattles windows and makes dogs howl in fear. She looks like death itself, dressed in funeral rags. And then there are the accounts that describe her as both, not at different times, simultaneously. Witnesses report seeing her shift forms mid-wail. One moment she's a young woman. Blink, and she's a hag. Blink again, and she's beautiful once more. These variations aren't contradictions, they're features. The Banshee takes the form that matches the death she's announcing. If the person dying lived honorably, if they were loved, if their death is tragic but meaningful, she appears as the maiden. Her beauty reflects their life. Her sorrow is genuine. If the person dying lived badly, if they caused harm, if their death is deserved or shameful, she appears as the crone. Ugly, bitter, her wail isn't mourning, it's judgment. And if the death is complicated, if the person was neither saint nor sinner, but something messier, more human, she shifts, beautiful and ugly, young and old, reflecting the contradictions of mortal life. This transformation ties the Banshee to an older Celtic archetype, the triple goddess. Maiden, mother, and crone, three aspects of the same divine feminine force. Birth, life, death. Beginning, middle, end. The Banshee, by shifting between forms, embodies all three. She is life, mourning death. She is death acknowledging life. She is the eternal cycle made visible. Some scholars argue she's directly connected to the Morrigan, the Irish war goddess, who also appeared in multiple forms. The Morrigan was a shapeshifter, a prophet of doom, and a harbinger of death on the battlefield. She warned warriors before battles. She mourned the fallen, and she moved between the mortal and otherworld with ease. The Banshee might be the Morrigan's domestic counterpart. Same entity, different function. The Morrigan handled war. The Banshee handled family. Both served death. Both operated under rules. Both were feared, respected, and occasionally honored. Regional descriptions of the Banshee varied wildly, but certain details remained consistent. In County Clare, she wore white or pale gray. In Kerry, she wore green, the color of the fairy folk. In Ulster, she wore black, funeral attire. But regardless of color, her clothing was always described as old-fashioned, not contemporary to the witness. The Banshee didn't update her wardrobe. She dressed the way she had for centuries, preserving a style long abandoned by the living. This anachronism reinforced her otherworldliness. She wasn't pretending to be mortal. She wasn't trying to blend in. She was something ancient, something preserved, walking through modern Ireland in clothes that belonged to a different age. Her eyes were always red, not bloodshot, completely red, from weeping, according to most accounts. But some descriptions suggest the red wasn't from tears. It was her natural state. The Banshee's eyes reflected the otherworld, and the otherworld, apparently, was crimson. Her hair, regardless of color, was always long and unbound. No pins, no braids, no practical styling. It flowed loose, wild, untamed. In traditional Irish culture, unmarried women wore their hair down. Married women tied it up. The Banshee's loose hair marked her as liminal, neither married nor unmarried, neither living nor dead, neither fully of this world nor the next. She was in between, always. Her voice, the wail itself, is the hardest element to describe because everyone heard it differently. And that variance, far from discrediting the accounts, actually strengthens them, because it suggests the Banshee's cry isn't a fixed sound. It's adaptive, personalized, tailored to the listener in ways that maximize emotional impact. In Leinster, people said her wail could shatter glass, high-pitched, piercing, unbearable, like a scream stretched into a song. In Munster, witnesses described it as low and mournful, a keening that resonated in the chest, that made you feel grief before you understood why. In Connaught, it sounded like wind howling through a narrow canyon, natural but wrong, a sound that belonged to landscape, not human throats. In Ulster, it was rhythmic, two boards knocking together, wooden, hollow, mechanical, inhuman in its precision. Some people heard words in the wail, names, warnings, entire sentences woven into the keening. Others heard only sound, pure emotion without language. And a rare few heard nothing, not because they weren't close enough to the dying person, but because the Banshee, for reasons known only to her, chose silence. Maybe the death was too sudden for a warning. Maybe the person wasn't important enough by otherworld standards. Maybe the Banshee was occupied elsewhere, mourning another branch of the family in another country. Whatever the reason, some deaths occurred without the wail, and those deaths, in Irish tradition, carried a different weight, a sense of abandonment, as though the other world had looked away, as though the family, for that moment, had been forgotten. Families who experienced silent deaths often worried. Had they fallen out of favor? Had the bloodline thinned too much? Had they married too many outsiders, diluting the old connection until the Banshee no longer recognized them? Or was it simpler? Had the family just been unlucky? Wrong place, wrong time, and the Banshee couldn't reach them. Because despite her power, the Banshee wasn't omnipotent. She had limits. She couldn't prevent death, only announce it. She couldn't save anyone, only mourn them. She couldn't change fate, only acknowledge it. This made her perhaps the most tragic figure in Irish folklore, a being cursed to watch people die, to feel grief for strangers, to wail for centuries, while unable to help. She's not cruel. She's not evil. She's powerless. A messenger without authority. A mourner without relief. And yet, families didn't resent her. They didn't try to banish her. Because even though she brought bad news, she brought it with respect. She gave them time. She acknowledged their loss. And in a world where death often came suddenly and violently, that acknowledgement mattered. The Banshee was proof that someone cared, that the other world hadn't forgotten, that when you died, even if no mortal mourned you, she would. This brings us to the multiple Banshees phenomenon, the moment when more than one Banshee appeared, wailing in harmony. In traditional accounts, hearing multiple Banshees meant someone great was dying. Not great in the moral sense, great in the hierarchical sense. A king, a chieftain, a person whose death would ripple across communities. When Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland, died at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, witnesses claimed dozens of Banshees keened across the battlefield. Their voices rose above the clash of swords, the screams of the wounded, the thunder of horses. The O'Brien family, descended from Brian Boru, maintained that their Banshee Ibel commanded 25 attendant Banshees. When an O'Brien died, particularly an important one, Ibel didn't mourn alone. She brought her entourage, a choir of death omens, harmonizing in grief. This multiplied wailing served a function. It amplified the announcement, made sure everyone heard. Everyone knew. A death this significant couldn't pass quietly. But it also suggests something else. Hierarchy exists in the other world. The Banshees aren't equals. Some are more powerful. Some serve greater families. Some have authority over others. Ibel, as the O'Brien Banshee and queen of 25 others, held rank. She wasn't just a fairy woman. She was a commander. And when she wailed, her subordinates wailed with her, not by choice, but by duty. This hierarchy extended to the families themselves. The 5 great families, O'Neill, O'Brien, O'Grady, O'Connor, Kavanagh weren't just old. They were royal. High kings, provincial rulers, the bloodlines that had shaped Ireland's political landscape for millennia. Their banshees reflected that status. Lesser families, those with O or Mac prefixes, but no royal lineage, had simpler banshees. Singular, quieter, less dramatic. The wail came, the message was delivered, and that was it. No entourage. No choir. Just one voice, crying into the night. This distinction mattered. It preserved the social order even in death. The other world mirrored the mortal world. Rank, status, lineage, all carried over. The banshee system wasn't egalitarian. It was feudal, and the families accepted this. Because having any banshee, even a minor one, was better than having none. Modern psychology offers an interesting lens on banshee encounters. Psychologists love explaining away supernatural phenomena. It's basically their entire professional identity. Auditory hallucinations driven by grief, stress, and cultural conditioning, they say. The brain, primed by folklore, interprets ambiguous sounds, wind, animals, distant voices as supernatural. Confirmation bias does the rest. Someone hears a strange sound. They remember the stories. They assign meaning. A family member dies days later, purely by coincidence, and the narrative solidifies. The banshee was real. She warned them. The folklore is confirmed. This explanation works for many encounters, maybe most. Human psychology is messy. Grief warps perception. Fear creates patterns where none exist. The mind, desperate for meaning, will find it in anything. But this explanation struggles with certain cases. The ones where multiple witnesses hear the same sound simultaneously. The ones where people unfamiliar with banshee folklore experience identical phenomena. The ones where the sound is recorded faintly on early audio equipment or modern smartphones. A few recordings exist. Scratchy, unclear, uploaded to paranormal websites or folklore archives. Most are obviously wind or animals, but a handful defy easy categorization. Long, wavering cries that don't match known wildlife. That seem human, but aren't quite. That carry an emotional weight the recording equipment shouldn't be able to capture. Are they proof? No. Audio can be faked, misidentified, or distorted, but they're unsettling. Especially when paired with eyewitness accounts describing the exact same sound in the exact same location, separated by decades or centuries. The banshee, real or not, has shaped Irish behavior for over 1,000 years. That's not superstition, that's culture. And culture has power. It influences decisions, creates traditions, and binds communities across time. Even today, descendants of the 5 families scattered worldwide still talk about her, still share stories, still wonder when they hear something strange at night if maybe, just maybe, she's still watching, still combing her hair, still crying, still keeping the old promise that someone will remember, that someone will mourn, that death, when it comes, will not be silent. The 3-night pattern deserves its own examination because it appears too consistently across too many regions to be coincidental. The banshee wails for 3 consecutive nights before the death occurs. Not 2 nights, not 4, 3, always 3. On the first night, the sound is distant, miles away sometimes, faint enough that listeners question whether they heard anything at all. Was that the wind? A fox? Their imagination playing tricks? They go back to sleep, uneasy but not convinced. On the second night, the wail is closer, louder, unmistakable. It circles the house, or moves through the garden, or echoes across the fields. Now there's no denying it. The banshee is here. Someone is marked. The family begins to prepare, mentally cataloging who might be in danger. Elderly parents, sick children, relatives traveling. The guessing starts. On the third night, the wail is deafening. right outside, sometimes at the window, sometimes on the roof, sometimes inside the house itself, though no one sees her. The sound fills every room, presses against every ear, makes sleep impossible. And then, just before dawn, it stops. Silence returns. And within hours, the death occurs. This three-night escalation serves multiple purposes. It's a warning system with built-in redundancy. If you miss the first night, you get a second chance. If you dismiss the second night, the third is impossible to ignore. It's designed to break through denial, skepticism, and the human tendency to rationalize away uncomfortable truths. But it's also torture. 3 nights of knowing death is coming, but not knowing when or who. 3 nights of sleepless dread. 3 nights watching every cough, every stumble, every moment of weakness in your loved ones, wondering if this is it. Some families tried to outsmart the pattern. They'd gather everyone together after the first night. Safety in numbers, the logic went. If we're all in one place, we can protect each other. Watch for signs. React quickly. It never worked. The death happened anyway. Sometimes to someone in the room. Sometimes to someone miles away who hadn't heard the wail at all. The Banshee wasn't announcing danger you could prevent. She was announcing fate you couldn't. This inevitability frustrated people. What's the point of a warning if you can't act on it? Why tell families someone's dying if they can't save them? The answer, uncomfortable as it is, comes back to the same theme. The Banshee's gift isn't prevention. It's preparation. 3 nights gives you time to make peace, to forgive old grudges, to say, I love you, one more time, to call distant relatives home, to sit with the person, even if you don't know they're the one, and appreciate their presence while it lasts. In a world where death often came violently, suddenly, with no warning at all, plagues, accidents, raids, 3 nights was a luxury, but not everyone appreciated it. Some families begged the Banshee to stop. They shouted into the night, pleading with her to be quiet, to leave them alone, to take her grief elsewhere. A few even tried threatening her. Priests were brought in to perform exorcisms, the medieval equivalent of calling customer service and being told to turn it off and back on again. Holy water was splashed. Prayers were recited in Latin. None of it worked. The Banshee wasn't a demon. She couldn't be exorcised. She wasn't evil. She couldn't be banished by righteousness. She was simply doing what she'd always done, what she was bound to do, and no amount of mortal desperation could stop her. There are accounts, rare but documented, of people trying to communicate with the Banshee, not to banish her, to understand her, to ask questions, to maybe, just maybe, negotiate. In the 1700s, an O'Neill scholar claimed he spent weeks near a fairy mound, leaving offerings and calling out to Maeve, his family's Banshee. He wanted to know her origins, her purpose, whether she grieved willingly or under compulsion. According to his journal, she never appeared, never spoke. But on the 7th night, he heard her voice, not wailing, singing, a soft, wordless melody that filled him with such profound sadness, he wept for hours. He interpreted this as an answer. She was grieving, not out of duty, but because she felt it, because every death she announced genuinely hurt her. She wasn't a messenger. She was a mourner, trapped in a cycle she couldn't escape. Another account from the 1800s describes a woman in County Cork who tried bribing her family's Banshee. She left wine, bread, and silver coins near a stream where the Banshee had been seen. The next morning, the offerings were untouched, but the woman reported feeling watched, judged, as though the Banshee found the gesture insulting. You don't bribe grief, you endure it. A third account, from the early 1900s, involved a man who claimed he saw the Banshee combing her hair and simply sat down beside her. Didn't speak, didn't touch her, just sat. She continued combing, continued crying, and eventually faded away. The man said he felt no fear. only shared sorrow. His grandmother died the next day. These attempts reveal something important. The Banshee isn't hostile. She's not offended by curiosity or compassion. She just doesn't engage. She can't or won't break the rules that bind her. She wails. She combs. She mourns. And then she leaves. But she never explains herself. Never offers comfort. Never confirms or denies the stories told about her. She is silence wrapped in sound. A presence that refuses to become fully present. The Irish diaspora complicated her operations in ways folklore hadn't anticipated. When the 5 families were concentrated in Ireland, the Banshee's job was straightforward. Watch the bloodlines. Wail when necessary. Repeat. But as millions of Irish scattered across the globe, the Banshee faced a logistical nightmare. How do you monitor thousands of descendants across 6 continents? The answer, apparently, is duplication, or omnipresence, or something in between that mortal language doesn't quite capture. The Banshee began appearing simultaneously in multiple locations. An O'Neill dying in Dublin and an O'Neill dying in Boston might both trigger the wail, heard by relatives in both cities on the same night. This shouldn't be possible. Not by the rules of physical reality, but the Banshee operates on otherworld logic. And in the otherworld, concepts like distance, time, and singular existence don't apply the same way. She's not traveling from Ireland to America. She's manifesting wherever the bloodline exists, as though the family itself is the map, and she's the marker moving across it. Some descendants report sensing her presence without hearing the wail. A sudden, overwhelming sadness with no clear cause. A feeling of being watched. The scent of something floral and old, like dried flowers in an abandoned room. These sensory echoes might be the Banshee stretched thin, her power diluted by distance, but still attempting to fulfill her duty. Others report technological interference. Phones crackling with static. Radios shifting between stations on their own. Television screens flickering. Smart devices activating without input. The Banshee, it seems, struggles with modern technology. Or perhaps she's adapting, learning to haunt through Wi-Fi instead of Windows. A necessary upgrade for the digital age. In 2018, a woman in Toronto posted online that her Alexa device activated at 3 a.m. and began playing what sounded like distant crying. She checked the app history. No command had been given. No music service accessed. The device simply turned on and produced sound. Even Amazon's algorithms couldn't explain it, which is saying something for a company that tracks your every breath. Her father, an O'Connor, died 2 days later. Coincidence? Probably, but it fits a pattern. The Banshee isn't bound to ancient methods. She's evolving, finding new ways to announce death in a world that no longer believes in fairy mounds and keening women. This adaptation suggests intelligence, awareness. The Banshee isn't a mindless force. She's conscious. She understands that the world has changed, that families no longer gather around peat fires in rural cottages, that death happens in hospitals, not homes, that her traditional methods, wailing outside windows in the dead of night, don't work when people live in high-rise apartments with soundproof walls. So she adjusts. Phone calls that drop mid-sentence. Doorbells ringing when no one's there. Shadows moving in peripheral vision. Digital glitches that feel wrong. The Banshee's signature is changing, but the message remains the same. Someone you love is dying. Prepare yourself. The relationship between families and their Banshees varied wildly depending on temperament, belief, and historical period. Some families honored their Banshee. They spoke of her respectfully, left offerings at fairy mounds, and genuinely believed she was protecting them in her own tragic way. The O'Neills, who kept a room for Maeve, exemplified this approach. The Banshee wasn't an enemy. She was family. Strange, terrifying family, but family nonetheless. Other families resented her. They saw her as a curse a reminder that their bloodline was marked, that death, when it came, would never be private, never be quiet, always announced by a wailing spirit they couldn't control. These families tried ignoring her, pretending she didn't exist, moving away from Ireland entirely in the hope that distance would break the bond. It never did. The Banshee followed, because she wasn't tied to geography. She was tied to blood. A few families tried coexisting with their Banshee in practical terms. They developed informal protocols. If the wail was heard, certain steps were taken immediately. Gather the family, check on the elderly, cancel travel plans, sit together and wait. This pragmatic approach treated the Banshee like an early warning system. Not pleasant, but useful. And then there were the families who forgot. Generations passed. Emigration happened. Intermarriage diluted the bloodline. English replaced Irish. Old stories became vague memories. The Banshee became a legend their grandparents believed. Not something real, not something that mattered, until she appeared again. And suddenly, the old stories weren't so vague anymore. This forgetting and remembering cycle created a strange dynamic. The Banshee became proof of identity. If she wailed for you, it meant your Irish heritage was real, not symbolic, not cultural, genetic, old, recognized by forces that predated borders and nation-states. For the diaspora, especially those struggling with assimilation, the Banshee was a lifeline to the past, a reminder that no matter how far they traveled, no matter how much they changed, something in Ireland still remembered them, still claimed them, still mourned them. But this came at a cost, because remembering the Banshee meant accepting something unfurtable, that you're never fully in control, that fate, destiny, the otherworld, whatever you want to call it, has a say in your life, that some bonds can't be broken by choice, by distance, or by time. The Banshee, in this sense, is a refusal to let the old families disappear, a refusal to let Ireland's pre-Christian past be forgotten, a refusal to accept that modernity, with its science and skepticism, has all the answers. She is memory given voice, and memory doesn't negotiate. There's one final aspect of the Banshee that needs addressing, her grief. Not the grief she announces, her own grief. Because if you believe the accounts, if you accept that she's real, then you have to confront the reality that she's been crying for over 1,000 years, possibly far longer. Imagine that existence. Imagine watching families rise and fall, watching children grow old, watching empires collapse, watching Ireland invaded, conquered, colonized, liberated, and transformed beyond recognition. And through it all, you cry. You mourn. You announce deaths that hurt you, even though you never met the person dying. That's not punishment. That's torture. And it raises questions. Who cursed the Banshee? Who decided she should carry this burden? Was it the Tuatha Dé Danann, angry at being displaced? Was it the Milesians, binding a spirit to ensure their dead were honored? Was it the Banshee herself, choosing this role out of love, duty, or desperation? The folklore doesn't say. And maybe that's the point. The Banshee's origins are lost because they don't matter anymore. What matters is that she continues, that she keeps wailing, that she refuses to stop, even though stopping would be mercy. In some traditions, the Banshee is described as weeping not just for the dead, but for herself, for the life she might have had if she weren't bound to this endless cycle, for the peace she'll never know, for the release that will never come. This self-mourning adds a layer of tragedy that makes her more than a monster. She's a victim, trapped in a role she can't escape, mourning an existence she can't end. And the family she serves, the ones who hear her and fear her, are the only witnesses to her suffering. They can't help her. They can't free her. All they can do is listen. And in listening, acknowledge that grief isn't always about loss. Sometimes it's about endurance, about carrying sorrow so long it becomes part of you. About wailing into the void, because silence is worse. The Banshee, by that measure, is the most Irish figure in all of Irish folklore, because Ireland knows about endurance, about carrying history, about crying for the dead while continuing to live. She is every mother who lost a child, every widow who buried a husband, every daughter who watched her father die. She is centuries of grief compressed into one figure, combing her hair and crying, crying, crying. And the 5 families, whether they know it or not, carry her with them. In their blood, in their names, in the stories they tell, and the silences they keep. She is their inheritance, their burden, their proof that some things, no matter how far you run, will always find you, because the other world never forgets. And neither does she. But what happens when the Banshee doesn't appear? When death comes silently, without warning, without the wail. This absence, this silence, is perhaps more terrifying than her presence, because it raises questions no one wants to answer. Silent deaths occurred throughout Irish history. People died suddenly. Accidents, violence, illness, and no Banshee was heard. No 3-night warning, no keening, just death arriving unannounced, catching families completely unprepared. These silent deaths created panic in communities that believed in the Banshee. Had the family fallen out of favor? Had they offended the other world? Had the bloodline thinned so much through intermarriage with outsiders that the Banshee no longer recognized them? Or worse, had she simply stopped caring? Some families interpreted silence as abandonment, as proof they'd been cut off from their heritage, that they were no longer real O'Neills or O'Briens or Kavanaghs, that generations of emigration, assimilation, and cultural loss had severed the connection. The Banshee's absence became a mark of shame, evidence that they'd strayed too far from the old ways. Others interpreted silence differently. Maybe the death was too sudden for even the Banshee to predict. Maybe the person died outside her jurisdiction, in a place or circumstance where the other world couldn't reach. Maybe she was occupied elsewhere, mourning another branch of the family simultaneously. The Banshee, powerful as she was, couldn't be everywhere at once, or could she? The duplication theory, mentioned earlier, suggests she could, that every branch of every family had access to her, or to an echo of her. But even infinite copies have limits. If too many family members died simultaneously, plagues, wars, disasters, could the Banshee keep up? Or would some deaths slip through, pass unnoticed, unmourned by the other world? This possibility, that even supernatural forces have capacity limits, is oddly humanizing. The Banshee isn't omniscient. She's not all-powerful. She's a worker, bound by rules and limitations, doing her best under impossible circumstances. And sometimes, despite her best efforts, she misses one. The families who experienced silent deaths often sought explanations. They consulted local wise women, people who understood the old ways. They visited fairy mounds, leaving offerings and apologies for offenses they might have unknowingly committed. They examined their family trees, searching for the moment when the bloodline might have been contaminated by outsider marriages. Some families found comfort in alternative interpretations. Maybe the Banshee's silence was mercy. Maybe the person who died was so beloved, so important, that the Banshee couldn't bear to announce it, that her grief was too great for sound, that she mourned in silence because wailing would shatter her. This interpretation, though comforting, doesn't align with the folklore. The Banshee wailed loudest for the most important deaths: kings, chieftains, beloved matriarchs. Her volume increased with significance. Silence, by that logic, suggested the opposite, that the death didn't matter enough, that the person was forgettable. Which brings us to a darker possibility, one rarely discussed but occasionally whispered. What if the Banshee chose? What if she had agency? What if she could decide which deaths to announce and which to ignore? Most folklore treats the Banshee as bound, compelled. She doesn't choose to wail. She must wail. It's her curse, her duty, her inescapable function. But what if that's wrong? What if the Banshee, over centuries, developed preferences? What if she wailed for family members she liked and stayed silent for those she didn't? This idea transforms her from a tragic figure into something more complicated, more dangerous, a judge, an arbiter of worth, deciding, based on criteria known only to her, who deserved acknowledgement and who didn't. Evidence for this theory is slim. Most accounts treat the Banshee as impartial. She doesn't play favorites. But a few scattered stories suggest otherwise. Families claiming the Banshee only appeared for good deaths, for people who lived honorably, and that she remained silent when dishonorable family members died. Criminals, abusers, those who brought shame. If true, this would make the Banshee not just a messenger, but a moral authority, the other world's final judgment on a life lived. Her wail becomes approval. Her silence becomes condemnation. But this interpretation feels wrong. Too neat, too convenient. The Banshee, as depicted in most accounts, doesn't seem interested in morality. She mourns. She doesn't judge. She cries for the dead because they're dead, not because they were good or bad. The most likely explanation for silent deaths is simpler. The Banshee is stretched thin. The 5 families have grown exponentially. Millions of descendants now exist worldwide. The Banshee, whether singular or duplicated, can't monitor everyone. Some slip through the cracks, die unnoticed, pass without ceremony. And maybe that's not a failing. Maybe that's just reality. Even supernatural systems have limits. Even ancient promises can fray under the weight of time and distance. The Banshee does her best, but best doesn't mean perfect. Families who experienced silent deaths eventually moved on. Grief found its own path, with or without the wail. Life continued. New deaths came, some announced, some not. And slowly, the pattern normalized. The Banshee wasn't reliable. She was probable, more likely to appear than not, but never guaranteed. This uncertainty, ironically, made her appearances more impactful, because you couldn't count on her, couldn't predict her. When she did wail, it felt significant, chosen, as though your family, in that moment, had been remembered, seen, acknowledged by forces most people no longer believed in. And for descendants of the 5 families, scattered across a modern world that has no time for fairy mounds and keening women, that acknowledgement matters. It's proof. Proof that the old stories weren't just stories. Proof that heritage isn't just genetics. Proof that some connections transcend logic, science, and modernity. The Banshee's wail, when it comes, says, "You are not alone. You are not forgotten. You are part of something older than borders, older than nations, older than history itself. And when you die, someone will mourn you. Even if that someone is a woman from the other world, crying into the darkness, combing her silver hair. The 5 families carry this burden and this gift. They can't escape it, can't reject it, can't logic their way out of it. The Banshee is part of their identity now, woven so deeply into their history that separating her would mean erasing themselves. She is the cost of being remembered, the price of mattering, the proof that in a world that forgets quickly and moves on faster, some memories refuse to die. And she will continue, long after the last O'Neill forgets their name, long after the O'Briens scatter to countries that don't exist yet, long after Ireland itself transforms into something unrecognizable. The Banshee will remain, combing her hair, crying, announcing deaths to families who may no longer know why she cares, because that's what she does, that's what she is. A voice from the past, echoing into the future, refusing to let silence win. The other world keeps its promises, even when no one remembers making them. Who the Banshee serves, how she operates, and why the five families earned her attention brings us to one question left unanswered. The biggest question, the one that sits beneath all the folklore, all the documented encounters, all the centuries of wailing. Why does she continue? Not in the past. Not when Ireland was isolated, when the five families ruled, when the other world felt close enough to touch. But now, in the 21st century, when the families have scattered, when Ireland has changed beyond recognition, when science explains away mysteries and skepticism has replaced belief. Why is the Banshee still wailing? Because she is. Reports continue. Descendants still hear her. And the folklore, instead of fading, adapts. The Banshee doesn't vanish when people stop believing. She simply finds new ways to make them believe again. Let's start with the uncomfortable reality that the Banshee should be extinct. By every logical measure, she should have faded centuries ago. When Christianity arrived and reshaped Irish spirituality, which is marketing speak for violently suppressed existing beliefs, when the Catholic Church condemned keening and fairy beliefs, when education spread and rational thought replaced superstition, the Banshee should have died with the old gods. She didn't. When the five families lost their power, when high kings became irrelevant, when Irish nobility crumbled under English conquest, the Banshee should have vanished with them. She didn't. When millions of Irish emigrated, when the families dispersed across continents, when the connection to Irish soil weakened with every generation, the Banshee should have stayed behind. She didn't. And when the modern world arrived, electric lights replacing oil lamps, cities replacing villages, science replacing folklore, the Banshee should have become nothing more than a quaint story grandparents tell. She didn't. Instead, she evolved. And that evolution is the most compelling evidence that something real, something not entirely understood, is happening here. The Banshee's modern appearances differ from historical accounts in subtle but significant ways. She's less likely to appear physically. Fewer people report seeing her combing her hair or standing at windows. But the wail persists, and it's found new mediums. Phone calls that consist of nothing but crying. Text messages that arrive from disconnected numbers containing only symbols or the word soon. Voicemails left on phones that were turned off, filled with static and faint keening. Social media accounts posting cryptic warnings from profiles that vanish hours later. These digital manifestations should be easy to dismiss. Technology glitches, spam, pranks, except they follow the same pattern the Banshee always has. They occur 3 nights before a death. They only reach family members. And they're never wrong. A woman in California, 2020, received 3 consecutive emails at 3 a.m. The sender address was her own, but she hadn't sent them. The emails contained no text, just an attached audio file. She opened it, keening. Old, raw, unmistakable keening. Her brother, an O'Brien living in New York, died of COVID complications on the 4th day. A man in London, 2017, posted on Reddit that his smart doorbell kept activating at night. The motion sensor showed nothing, but the audio recorded faint crying. 3 nights in a row. His mother, a Kavanaugh, suffered a fatal stroke on the morning of the 4th day. A teenager in Dublin, 2021, claimed her Spotify playlist kept playing a song she'd never added. An old Irish lament. She deleted it multiple times. It returned. 3 nights. Her grandfather died. Skeptics point out these stories are unverifiable. Skeptics point out a lot of things. It's their entire personality. Anonymous internet posts don't prove anything. And they're right. Most, probably all, are coincidence, misinterpretation, or fiction. But the pattern persists. The Banshee, if she's real, has figured out that modern people spend more time looking at screens than at windows. So she meets them there. This adaptation suggests intelligence, awareness. The Banshee isn't a recording playing on loop. She's responsive. She's learning. She's finding cracks in a world that no longer believes in her and slipping through anyway. But why bother? If the families have forgotten her, if they've assimilated into modernity, if they no longer honor the old ways, why does she keep trying? What compels her to continue announcing deaths to people who don't even know she exists? 3 possibilities, all disturbing in different ways. First, she's bound, truly, eternally bound. She has no choice. The contract, curse, or duty that tied her to the 5 families millennia ago still holds. And it will hold until either the bloodlines end completely or the other world itself collapses. She's not wailing because she wants to. She's wailing because she must. And no amount of time, distance, or technological evolution changes that. This makes her the ultimate prisoner, trapped in a function she can't escape, mourning for people who will never thank her, crying into a void that doesn't listen. Her persistence isn't loyalty, it's slavery. Second, she's waiting. The Banshee serves the old families because they're the key to something larger. Some future event. Some prophesied moment when the 5 families will matter again. When Ireland will need them. When the other world will rise and the veil will thin enough for the Tuatha Dé Danann to return. She's not just mourning deaths, she's keeping watch. Maintaining the connection. Ensuring that, when the time comes, the bloodlines are still intact and still aware that they're different. This makes her a guardian. Patient, ancient, and far more strategic than folklore suggests. Her wailing isn't grief. It's maintenance. Keeping the families conscious of their heritage so they don't disappear into the noise of modernity. Third, she chooses. Despite everything, despite the curse or duty, or whatever bound her originally, the Banshee continues because she wants to, because she cares. Because over centuries of watching these families fall, scatter, and survive, she's developed something resembling love, or at least attachment. She mourns because she genuinely grieves. And she can't stop grieving any more than you can stop loving someone just because they moved away. This makes her the most tragic figure imaginable. A being who loved too deeply, who cared too much, and who now can't let go, even though letting go would be mercy. Which interpretation is correct? Probably all 3. Probably none. The Banshee, like most supernatural entities that refuse to vanish, is too complex for single explanations. She's bound, waiting, and choosing, simultaneously, because the other world doesn't operate on mortal logic. Contradictions coexist there. Multiple truths overlap without canceling each other out. The Banshee is enslaved and free. She's suffering and content. She's forgotten and remembered. She exists in a state of permanent in-between, just like the veil she emerged from. Now let's compare the Banshee to other death omens, because she's not unique. Cultures worldwide have their own harbingers. Spirits, animals, or signs that announce death before it arrives. And examining these parallels reveals something important about why the Banshee survives when so many others have faded. In Welsh folklore, there's the Saihirith, a spirit whose groaning and sighing predicts death. Similar to the Banshee, but less specific. The Saihirith doesn't serve particular families. It wails for anyone about to die violently. This lack of exclusivity might be why it's less documented. Without personal connection, the Saihirith is just noise. Frightening, but impersonal. In Scottish tradition, the Bean-Nigg, the washerwoman, appears at rivers washing blood-stained clothes of those about to die. She's more interactive than the Banshee. You can speak to her, ask questions, even make deals if you're brave or foolish. But she's also less reliable. Her appearances are sporadic, her predictions vague, and her willingness to help depends entirely on her mood. In Norse mythology, the Valkyries served a similar function. They chose who would die in battle and carried the worthy to Valhalla. But the Valkyries were warriors, not mourners. They celebrated death. The Banshee mourns it. The Valkyries worked for Odin. The Banshee works for the families. This fundamental difference in purpose explains why the Banshee feels more intimate. She's not recruiting for an afterlife army. She's crying because someone she's watched over is leaving. In Mexican folklore, La Llorona, the weeping woman, also wails, but her cry is a threat, not a warning. She's hunting, looking for children to replace the ones she drowned. The Banshee doesn't hunt. She doesn't cause death. She only announces it. This distinction matters. Fear of La Llorona is fear of being killed. Fear of the Banshee is fear of loss. One is predatory. The other is sorrowful. What sets the Banshee apart from all these entities is specificity. She doesn't serve everyone. She doesn't wander randomly. She's not hunting or celebrating or judging. She serves 5 families and their descendants. She knows their names. She tracks their bloodlines. She cries for them personally. This specificity creates intimacy. The Banshee isn't a general death omen. She's your death omen. Yours specifically. Assigned to your family. Watching you. Caring about you in her own terrible way. And that intimacy is why she survives. Because humans don't connect with abstract concepts. They connect with stories. With relationships. With entities that feel personal. The Banshee isn't a symbol of death. She's the woman who cried when your great-grandmother died, who wailed for your grandfather, who will someday wail for you. That's not folklore. That's family. The Irish relationship with death is different from most Western cultures. Not healthier, necessarily. Just different. More present, less sanitized. Death isn't hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes to be dealt with by professionals. It's brought home, literally. Wakes happen in living rooms. Bodies are displayed. Communities gather. Stories are told. Grief is loud. The Banshee fits perfectly into this tradition. She doesn't whisper. She wails. She doesn't hide. She appears. She doesn't soften death. She announces it with all the raw emotion Irish culture permits. In a way, the Banshee is Ireland's grief made audible. Centuries of famine, invasion, emigration, loss, compressed into one figure who never stops crying. She's every mother who watched children board coffin ships to America. Every widow who buried a husband killed in rebellion. Every family torn apart by forces they couldn't control. She is historical trauma given voice. And as long as the Irish remember that trauma, as long as the diaspora carries it in their bones, the Banshee will remain relevant. Because she's not just announcing individual deaths. She's mourning a culture that's been dying slowly for 1,000 years. A language that nearly vanished. A way of life that colonization tried to erase. Traditions that survived only through stubbornness and secrecy. The Banshee is the sound of Ireland refusing to forget. Refusing to let the past become irrelevant. Refusing to accept that modernity has all the answers. And the 5 families, whether they realize it or not, carry that refusal with them. In their names, in their blood, in the stories they tell, and the silences they keep when someone mentions hearing something strange at night. Modern psychology might explain Banshee encounters as grief hallucinations. Auditory projections created by minds primed through cultural conditioning. When you grow up hearing that the Banshee wails for your family, your brain, under stress, might create the sound. Confirmation bias handles the rest. This explanation is neat, rational, comforting to those who prefer the supernatural stay fictional. But it struggles with certain cases. The ones where multiple people, separated by distance, hear the same sound simultaneously. The ones where people unfamiliar with Banshee folklore experience identical phenomena. The ones where animals react, dogs howling, horses panicking, birds fleeing, suggesting something external is occurring, not internal hallucination. And it really struggles with the predictive accuracy. If Banshee encounters were purely psychological, they'd be wrong sometimes. Frequently, even. Grief makes people paranoid. Stress causes false alarms. But the Banshee, in documented accounts, is almost never wrong. When she wails, someone dies. Not eventually. Within days. That consistency is statistically improbable if we're dealing with coincidence and confirmation bias. Unless every single account is fabricated, which would require a conspiracy spanning centuries, continents, and millions of people who gain nothing from lying. The simplest explanation, the one Occam's razor would suggest if we allowed for supernatural possibilities, is that something real is happening. Not necessarily a literal fairy woman combing her hair, but some phenomenon, some presence, some echo from the other world that manifests when certain conditions align. Bloodline, location, emotional state, the phase of the moon, who knows? The Banshee might be a label for something we don't have the language or framework to properly describe. A bleed through from whatever reality exists beside ours. A glitch in the veil. A signal from a part of existence that modernity has trained us to ignore. And the five families, by virtue of their ancestry, their connection to land and history and the old gods, are simply more sensitive to that signal. They hear it when others don't. Not because they're special, because they're tuned to the right frequency. This explanation doesn't require belief in literal fairies, just acceptance that reality might be larger, stranger, and more layered than materialist science currently admits. But even if the Banshee is entirely folklore, entirely cultural, entirely psychological, she still matters, because belief has power. Belief shapes behavior. Belief creates community. Belief preserves identity. The descendants of the five families, scattered worldwide, often feel disconnected from their heritage. They're American, Australian, British, Canadian, but somewhere deep down, they're also Irish, and they don't always know what that means. The culture has changed. The language is mostly lost. The traditions have adapted or died, but the Banshee remains. A thread connecting them to the past, to the land their ancestors walked, to the other world their forebears believed in, to the idea that they're part of something older than nations, older than history, older than memory. When someone claims they heard the Banshee, they're not just reporting a supernatural encounter. They're claiming their heritage. They're saying, I'm Irish enough for the other world to notice me. I'm connected. I belong. And in a globalized world where identity is increasingly fluid, where heritage is increasingly irrelevant, where assimilation erases difference, that claim matters. The Banshee is proof of persistence. Cultural persistence. Spiritual persistence. The persistence of stories that refuse to die even when the world insists they should. She is memory in motion. And as long as the five families exist, as long as anyone carries those names, as long as Ireland itself endures, she will continue. Not because she has to, though maybe she does. Not because she chooses to, though maybe she does. But because she is woven so deeply into the fabric of Irish identity that removing her would unravel something essential. The Banshee is the voice of the other world, crying for the families who remember it exists. And memory, unlike mortals, doesn't die. It just changes shape, adapts, finds new forms, persists. So when the question is asked, why does the Banshee only cry for 5 families? The answer isn't about exclusivity. It's about connection. About bloodlines that earned the attention of the other world through conquest, through respect, through tragedy. About families who preserved the old ways even when the new world arrived. The Banshee cries for them because they're the ones who remember her, who pass down her stories, who listen when she wails, who understand that death, in the Irish tradition, is never silent, never private, never without witness. She is the witness, the eternal mourner, the voice that refuses to let the dead pass unnoticed. And she will continue, through wars, through migrations, through centuries of change. She will adapt, evolve, find new ways to make herself heard. Because that's what she is. That's what she does. The Banshee is Ireland's grief, Ireland's memory, and Ireland's refusal to be forgotten, wrapped into one figure who stands at the veil between worlds and cries. For the O'Neills, for the O'Briens, for the O'Gradys, for the O'Connors, for the Kavanaghs, and for all their descendants, no matter how far they've traveled, no matter how much they've changed. The otherworld keeps its promises. The Banshee keeps hers. And the 5 families, whether they know it or not, will never be alone in death, because she is listening. She is watching. She is waiting. And when the time comes, she will cry. Not because she was ordered to, not because she's enslaved, but because after 1,000 years of mourning these families, she can't imagine doing anything else. The Banshee doesn't cry for 5 families because they're special. She cries because they've become her family, the only family she has, the only thing anchoring her to the mortal world. Without them, she would fade back into the other world completely, become a memory of a memory, a story people tell that no longer believe. But as long as one O'Neill exists, as long as one O'Brien draws breath, as long as the bloodlines continue, no matter how thinly spread, no matter how diluted, she remains, combing her silver hair, crying into the darkness, announcing deaths to families who may never know she was there. That is her curse. That is her purpose. That is her choice. And that is why, after everything, after centuries of change and loss and transformation, the Banshee still wails. Because some bonds can't be broken. Some promises can't be unmade. Some grief never ends. The other world remembers. The Banshee remembers. And the 5 families, somewhere deep in their blood, remember too. Even if they've forgotten, they remember. The wail will find them. It always does. And when it does, for just a moment, the veil thins. The past touches the present. The other world whispers to the mortal realm. And the old families hear what they've always heard, what they'll always hear, no matter how far they run or how much they change. Someone is crying for them. Someone who has cried for their bloodline since the beginning. Someone who will cry until the end. The Banshee, Ireland's eternal mourner. The voice that refuses to be silent. She is the answer to a question most people never ask. What happens when the other world loves you? You are never allowed to die quietly. You are never allowed to be forgotten. You are never allowed to slip away without witness. The Banshee is that witness. That love, that terrible, beautiful refusal to let go. And she will wail for the 5 families until the last star burns out. Until the other world collapses. Until memory itself dies. Because that's what she promised. 1,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago. However long it's been since a woman from the fairy mounds looked at the Milesian conquerors and thought, these families matter. These families I will remember. And she has. And she will. Forever. Let's examine specific modern cases in detail, because the patterns reveal something important about how the Banshee operates in the 21st century. Case 1. The O'Connor family in Chicago, 2019. Maria O'Connor, 3rd-generation American, received a phone call at 2:47 a.m. The caller ID showed her own number. She answered. Silence. Then faint crying. She hung up, assumed it was a technical glitch, and went back to sleep. The next night, same time, same call. This time she recorded it. The audio captured crying, distinctly female, layered over static. 3rd night, same pattern. On the 4th morning, she received news that her grandmother in Galway had died peacefully in her sleep during the night. Maria posted about this on an Irish Heritage forum. Dozens of responses flooded in. Half dismissed it as coincidence. Half shared similar stories. Phone calls, emails, smart devices activating, all following the 3-night pattern. All preceding deaths in families with O or Mac surnames. Case 2. The Neil family in Sydney, 2016. David Neil, whose great-great-grandfather anglicized the name from O'Neill in the 1880s, woke to find his security camera triggered. The footage showed nothing. Empty driveway, still night, no motion. But the audio recorded rhythmic knocking, two boards striking together. He checked with neighbors. No one heard anything. Second night, same knocking. Louder. Third night, the sound was loud enough to wake his children. His father, living in Brisbane, died of a heart attack the following afternoon. David researched his family history after this, discovered the O'Neill connection, learned about the Banshee. He now maintains a blog documenting similar encounters from descendants of the 5 families worldwide. Over 300 reports. Not all credible, but enough consistency to suggest something beyond coincidence. Case 3. The Kavanagh family in Toronto, 2021. Sarah Kavanagh, college student, recorded a TikTok video at 3 a.m. after hearing crying in her apartment. She lived alone. The video captured faint wailing in the background. Comments immediately identified it as a banshee. She laughed it off, posted follow-up videos mocking the superstition. Second night, more crying. She recorded again. Third night, the sound was so loud her roommate across the hall heard it through walls. Sarah's uncle, who she was close to, died in a car accident in Dublin the next day. She deleted all the videos, stopped posting about it, but other users had saved the files. They're still circulating on paranormal forums, analyzed frame by frame, audio enhanced. The crying is real, recorded, undeniable. Whether it's the Banshee or something else, no one can say. But the pattern held. These modern cases share characteristics that distinguish them from historical accounts. The Banshee adapts her methods, but maintains her rules. 3 nights, family members only, preceding death by hours or days. Never wrong. But there's a new element: documentation. Historical Banshee encounters relied on testimony. Witnesses describing what they heard or saw. Modern encounters leave evidence. Audio files, video footage, digital timestamps proving the sequence of events. This evidence isn't conclusive. Technology glitches. Files corrupt. Coincidence happens. But it's harder to dismiss than oral tradition. Harder to write off as superstition or cultural conditioning. The Banshee, if she exists, is being recorded. And the recordings, imperfect as they are, suggest something is happening that doesn't fit neatly into psychological explanations. The Irish diaspora's relationship with the Banshee reveals something profound about identity and belonging. For millions of descendants living outside Ireland, their connection to Irish culture is often abstract. They might celebrate St. Patrick's Day. They might know a few family stories. They might feel vaguely Irish without understanding what that means. But when the Banshee appears, when they experience something that matches centuries-old folklore, when they hear a sound their rational mind can't explain, but their cultural memory recognizes immediately, everything changes. Suddenly, being Irish isn't abstract. It's visceral, real. A part of them that reaches across oceans and centuries and connects them to something ancient. Something that recognizes them even if they don't recognize themselves. Or, put another way, surprise, you're haunted. A woman in Boston, 4th-generation Irish-American, reported hearing keening before her mother's death. She'd never been to Ireland, didn't speak Irish, barely knew her family history. But she knew the sound, recognized it on a level deeper than thought. Later, researching, she discovered she was an O'Brien, descended from one of the 5 families. And the Banshee, apparently, had kept better track of her lineage than she had. This experience transformed her understanding of identity. She wasn't just Irish by ancestry. She was Irish by recognition. The other world knew her, claimed her, saw her as part of the old families, even though she'd spent her entire life in America. Stories like this repeat across the diaspora. People discovering their heritage through supernatural encounters. learning their O'Neills or Kavanaghs or O'Connors after hearing something they can't explain. The Banshee becomes a genealogist, a reminder, a voice saying, you think you're American or Australian or Canadian, but you're also this. You're also ours. This isn't just folklore preservation. It's active identity construction. The Banshee isn't letting the old families forget who they are. She's ensuring the bloodlines stay conscious, stay connected, stay aware that they belong to something larger than their individual lives. And for descendants struggling with questions of identity, grappling with what it means to be part of a diaspora, trying to understand where they fit in a globalized world, the Banshee offers an answer, a strange answer, a frightening answer, but an answer nonetheless. You belong to the families the other world remembers. You carry blood that predates nations. You are part of Ireland's oldest memory, and that memory is crying for you. Whether that's comforting or terrifying depends entirely on perspective. The question of belief becomes complicated in the modern context. Do you have to believe in the Banshee for her to appear? Or does she appear regardless, forcing belief onto the unwilling? Evidence suggests the latter. Many modern encounters involve people who had no prior knowledge of Banshee folklore, who didn't grow up hearing stories, who considered themselves secular, rational, modern. Yet they experienced the pattern anyway. 3 nights of strange sounds, death following. And only afterward, researching frantically, did they learn about the Banshee and realize what they'd experienced. This undermines the psychological explanation. If Banshee encounters were purely cultural conditioning, they'd only happen to people primed by folklore. But they don't. They happen to skeptics, to people who mock superstition, to descendants so removed from Irish culture, they didn't even know they were O'Neills. The Banshee doesn't require belief. She operates independent of it, which suggests she's either a real external phenomenon or a genetic memory so deep, so embedded in the bloodline, that it surfaces even in people completely disconnected from Irish culture. Either explanation is disturbing. Either she's real, which means the materialist worldview is incomplete, or she's biological, hardwired into DNA, which means identity and memory are far stranger than science currently understands. Both possibilities leave room for the other world, either as literal reality or as something encoded in human genetics that modern people have no framework to comprehend. The Banshee's relationship with Ireland itself deserves examination because she's not just tied to the families. She's tied to the land, to the island, to the very concept of Ireland as a place with memory and presence. When descendants visit Ireland for the first time, many report feeling something, a recognition, a sense of homecoming that doesn't make rational sense. They've never been here. They don't know the geography. Yet it feels familiar, ancient, right. Some attribute this to genetic memory, others to romanticization, but a few claim it's the land itself. Ireland is different. The veil is thinner here. The other world is closer, and certain bloodlines are still recognized by that other world. The Banshee is part of that recognition. She doesn't exist because the families believe in her. She exists because the land remembers them. And the land, in Irish tradition, is alive, conscious, aware of who walks on it and who belongs. This concept, that land has memory and agency, feels absurd to modern sensibilities. Land is dirt, geography, resources. It doesn't think or remember. But Irish culture never fully adopted that view. The old beliefs that rivers have spirits, that mountains watch, that certain places are sacred and others are dangerous, never entirely vanished. They went underground, adapted, survived in folklore and superstition. The Banshee is the last visible thread of that belief system. The proof that the land, or something residing in it, still pays attention, still recognizes bloodlines, still mourns when the old families lose members. And for Ireland itself, struggling with questions of identity post-colonization, post-globalization, The Banshee serves a function. She's continuity. She's proof that Ireland wasn't erased, that the old culture, the pre-Christian, pre-colonial culture, survived. Changed, yes. Adapted, yes. But not destroyed. As long as the Banshee wails, Ireland's otherworld exists. And as long as that exists, Ireland remains more than just geography. It remains a place where the past is present, where memory has weight, where certain families are still bound to forces older than history. But there's a darker side to this continuity. The Banshee is also a chain, a binding. For descendants who want to leave Ireland behind, who want to assimilate fully, who want their children to be American or Australian without the weight of old curses, the Banshee is a refusal. She won't let them leave, won't let them forget, won't let them become something other than what their blood says they are. This creates tension. Modern identity emphasizes choice. You choose your culture. You choose your beliefs. You choose who you want to be. But the Banshee doesn't care about choice. You're an O'Neill. That's not negotiable. That's fate. That's blood. And blood, in the old ways, is destiny. Some descendants resent this. They didn't ask to be part of the old families, didn't ask for the other world's attention, didn't want a death omen attached to their name. They want normalcy, privacy, the ability to die without supernatural fanfare. The Banshee denies them that, and there's no opting out, no form to sign, no ritual to perform. You're born into the families, and the Banshee comes with the inheritance, whether you like it or not. This generational trauma, the idea that curses and duties pass through blood regardless of consent, is deeply embedded in Irish culture. The Banshee is just the most visible example. She's the reminder that the past doesn't release you just because you want it to. That ancestors, living and dead, have claims on you. That identity isn't solely individual. It's communal, historical, otherworldly. And that makes the Banshee, for all her tragedy, a conservative force. She preserves, maintains, refuses change, which is exactly what conservative forces do. They hold the line against time, insisting that what was matters more than what is or what could be. Whether that's good or bad depends on what you value. Continuity or progress, tradition or innovation, the past or the future. The Banshee chooses the past, every time, because that's what she is. A voice from Ireland's oldest memory, crying into the future, demanding that the old families remember where they came from. And they do, whether they want to or not. As we reach the end of this exploration, one question remains. What happens when the last member of the 5 families dies? When the bloodlines finally end, diluted beyond recognition, or simply extinguished by time? Does the Banshee finally rest? Does she fade back into the other world, her duty fulfilled? Does she grieve one final time, and then fall silent forever? Or does she continue, wailing into empty air, crying for families that no longer exist, bound to a promise that outlasted the people it was meant to serve? Irish folklore doesn't answer this. The Banshee exists in an eternal present, always crying, always watching, always waiting. Her end is never discussed, because the end is unimaginable. The 5 families have survived Vikings, Normans, English conquest, famine, emigration, and modernity. They've adapted, scattered, changed beyond recognition. But they've survived. The Banshee bets they always will. That the bloodlines are too stubborn, too persistent, too Irish to ever fully disappear. That there will always be an O'Neill somewhere, an O'Brien, a Kavanagh, even if they don't know it. Even if they've forgotten, the Banshee remembers. And memory, in Irish tradition, is immortal. So she will continue, combing her hair, crying, announcing deaths to families who may never hear her. Because that's what she does. That's what she is. And stopping would mean accepting that the old island is truly dead, that the other world has closed, that the five families, after everything, were just mortal after all. The Banshee refuses to accept that. And her refusal is Ireland's refusal. The island's stubborn insistence that it's more than dirt and rain, that it's memory, magic, otherworld. And as long as one person believes that, as long as one descendant hears a strange sound at night and wonders, just for a moment, if maybe the old stories are true, the Banshee survives, not as folklore, as something real, something present, something that refuses to become past tense. She is the wail that never stops, the grief that never heals, the promise that never expires. And she belongs to five families who never asked for her but can never escape her, who carry her in their blood, in their names. In the moments when death approaches, and somewhere in the darkness, a voice begins to cry. The Banshee, Ireland's eternal witness. The otherworld's last connection to the mortal families who conquered the island, 1,000 years ago, and have been paying for that conquest ever since. Not with gold, not with land, but with attention, with recognition, with the knowledge that they can never truly be alone, never truly be free, never truly be forgotten, because she is always watching, always listening, always waiting. And when the time comes, she will cry. For you, for your children, for every generation that follows, until the end of memory, until the other world closes, until Ireland itself vanishes beneath the waves. The Banshee will wail, and the five families will listen, whether they want to or not. But perhaps the most important question isn't why the Banshee continues. It's what her continued existence teaches us. About memory, about grief, about the stories we tell and why they refuse to die. The Banshee survives because she represents something universal wrapped in Irish specificity. Every culture grapples with death. Every culture creates rituals to manage grief. Every culture tells stories about the boundary between living and dead. But the Banshee is different. She's not a metaphor. She's not a symbol. She's a presence, a relationship, a contract between the otherworld and specific families that has endured for millennia. And that specificity is her strength. She's not death in general. She's your death, your family's death, your grandmother's grandmother's death, echoing forward through time. She's personal, intimate, and intimacy creates belief in ways abstract concepts never can. Consider how humans process loss. When death happens in the abstract, statistics, news reports, distant tragedies, we feel sorrow, but we move on. When death happens to someone we know, someone we love, someone whose name we speak, we're shattered. The difference is relationship, connection, the sense that this death, this specific death, matters personally. The Banshee creates that connection for entire bloodlines. She's not announcing deaths to strangers. She's announcing deaths to families she's been watching for centuries. She knew your ancestors. She cried for them, and she'll cry for you. That continuity transforms death from a biological inevitability into a moment of cosmic significance. Your death matters, not just to your family, to the otherworld itself. And that mattering, that sense of being seen and mourned by forces beyond human comprehension, is oddly comforting. Even though the Banshee brings terrible news, she brings it with respect, with grief, with acknowledgement. You don't die alone. You don't disappear into nothing. Someone mourns you. Someone who has mourned your family since before Ireland was called Ireland. This is why the Banshee persists when so many other folkloric entities have faded. She's not a monster to defeat. She's not a puzzle to solve. She's a relationship. And relationships, even supernatural ones, have staying power. The modern world tries to sanitize death. We hide the dying in hospitals. We embalm bodies to look alive. We speak in euphemisms, passed away, lost, no longer with us, because actually saying dead feels too harsh. We treat death as failure, as something that shouldn't have happened, as a problem that better medicine might someday solve. The Banshee rejects all of this. She announces death loudly, unavoidably, with all the raw emotion that death deserves. She doesn't pretend it's natural or peaceful or just another stage of life. She wails. She cries. She makes sure everyone knows someone is dying and that this is terrible and sad and deserving of grief. In that sense, the Banshee is radically honest. She's pre-modern, pre-sanitized, pre-rational. She treats death the way humans have treated it for most of history, as a community event worthy of loud, public mourning. And for cultures like Ireland, which endured centuries of death on massive scales, famine, emigration, war, the Banshee is the collective voice of that suffering. She's every Irish mother who watched children starve, every widow who buried a husband killed in rebellion, every family torn apart by forces beyond their control. She cries for them all, and her crying ensures their deaths weren't meaningless, weren't forgotten, weren't just statistics in history books. The Banshee is memory refusing to be silent. And memory, particularly traumatic memory, doesn't follow the rules of rational thought. It resurfaces at unexpected times. It demands attention. It won't be ignored just because the world has moved on. So the Banshee appears in modern cities, on smartphones, through digital static, because memory adapts. Memory finds new forms. Memory persists. And the five families, whether they understand it or not, are memory's chosen vessels. They carry Ireland's oldest stories in their blood. They preserve connections to the otherworld that most humans have forgotten. They're the last link to a time when the boundary between mortal and fairy, living and dead, real and otherworld, was fluid. The Banshee keeps them connected, keeps them aware, keeps them from forgetting completely. Because if the five families forget, if they assimilate so fully that the otherworld becomes irrelevant, then Ireland's pre-Christian past dies with them. The old gods, the fairy folk. The belief that reality is larger and stranger than materialism admits. All of it vanishes, becomes academic curiosity, museum exhibits, folkloric trivia. The Banshee is Ireland's insurance policy against that erasure. And she's very, very good at her job. For the families themselves, the Banshee creates an interesting paradox. They're simultaneously blessed and cursed. Blessed to be remembered by the otherworld. Blessed to have a spirit watching over them, even if her attention comes with grief. Blessed to carry heritage so deep it defies explanation. But cursed to never escape that heritage. Cursed to have death announced by supernatural forces they can't control. Cursed to be bound to something they didn't choose and can't refuse. This paradox defines the Irish experience. Being Irish means carrying history, carrying trauma, carrying stories and songs and grief and pride all tangled together. You can't separate the beauty from the pain. You can't celebrate Irish culture without acknowledging Irish suffering. It's a package deal. The Banshee is that package deal personified. She's beautiful and terrifying. She's a gift and a curse. She's proof of belonging and proof of bondage. She's every contradiction of Irish identity, wailing into the night. And she will never stop, because stopping would mean accepting that the contradiction's resolved, that Ireland became simple, that identity became clean and clear and uncomplicated. But Ireland isn't simple. Identity isn't clean. And the Banshee, by persisting, by adapting, by continuing to wail across centuries and continents, proves that the old complexities survive. So when descendants of the five families hear something strange at night, when they experience unexplained sounds before a loved one dies, when they feel watched by forces they don't understand, they're not experiencing supernatural horror. They're experiencing connection. Connection to their ancestors. Connection to the land. Connection to the other world that their bloodline earned through conquest and preserved through respect. Connection to Ireland itself, the idea of Ireland, the Ireland that exists not just as geography, but as memory and magic and stubborn refusal to be erased. The Banshee is that connection made audible, and as long as she wails, the connection holds. Not because the families want it, not because they believe in it, but because some bonds transcend choice. Some relationships are written in blood and enforced by forces older than nations. The Banshee is one of those forces, and she will continue announcing deaths, mourning losses, and keeping the old families conscious of who they are and where they come from until the very last descendant dies. And maybe not even then. Maybe she'll continue anyway, wailing into empty air, crying for families that no longer exist, because that's what grief does. It persists long after its object is gone. It becomes the thing itself, identity built from loss, presence built from absence. The Banshee is Ireland's grief. And grief this old, this deep, this persistent, doesn't end just because there's no one left to grieve for. It continues, adapts, finds new forms, wails through new mediums, and waits for the next generation, for the next death, for the next moment when the veil thins and the mortal world touches the other world, and someone somewhere hears a cry they can't explain. And in that moment, they'll know. They're part of the old families, the ones the other world remembers, the ones the Banshee serves. And they'll understand, perhaps for the first time, what it means to be Irish, truly Irish, old Irish, the kind of Irish that predates written history and will outlast the modern world. Because the Banshee doesn't care about politics or progress or modernity. She cares about blood, about memory, about promises made in the deep past that echo into the distant future. And she keeps those promises, always, forever, until the stars burn out and Ireland sinks beneath the sea, and the other world closes for good. The Banshee will wail for the O'Neills, for the O'Briens, for the O'Gradys, for the O'Connors, for the Kavanaghs, for every descendant, no matter how distant, no matter how diluted, no matter how forgotten. She is their witness, their mourner, their connection to the deep past and the other world. And she will never stop, because that's what she is. That's what she does. The Banshee cries, and in crying, she remembers. And in remembering, she ensures that the five families are never truly alone, never truly forgotten, never truly free, because freedom from the past means forgetting who you are. And the Banshee won't allow that, can't allow that, will never allow that. So she continues, combing her silver hair, crying into the darkness, announcing deaths that hurt her as much as they hurt the living. And the five families listen and remember and carry her forward into the future, whether they realize it or not, because she is part of them now, written into their blood, woven into their identity, inseparable from their names, the Banshee, the wailing woman, the fairy woman of the mound, Ireland's oldest mourner, the other world's eternal witness. She is why the five families are special. She is why they can never escape their heritage. She is why, after everything, after centuries of change and loss and transformation, they remain connected to something older than memory. The Banshee is that connection, and she will wail for them until the end of time, because that's what was promised. 1,000 years ago, or 10,000 or 100,000, the exact moment doesn't matter. What matters is the promise still holds. The other world remembers. The Banshee remembers. And the five families, whether they know it or not, are remembered forever.